Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepy Scares. I know many of you tune in to unwind and drift off into a peaceful sleep, so before you settle in, I'd love for you to drop a comment, letting me know where in the world you're listening from. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get cozy, relax, and dive right in. Story 1. The Sapphire. Waters of the Usani archipelago glistened under the morning sun, but the island of Kreverth, the smallest of the chain, stood shrouded in mist. Unlike its lush neighbors, Kreverth bore no vibrant flora or sandy beaches. Its jagged cliffs and coarse black sand reflected an ominous stillness, as if time itself refused to touch the land. Travelers rarely docked here, save for those desperate or reckless enough to ignore the warnings. Aiden Rulke, a marine biologist seeking rare specimens, was neither. Desperation was an effective motivator. His latest expedition funding hinged on the discovery of something remarkable. Stories of strange, bioluminescent organisms dwelling in Kreverth's coastal caves had reached him through a drunken sailor in a Seabridge tavern. Against the pleas of his colleagues, he had chartered a boat and made his way to the island. The shoreline greeted him with an unnatural silence. No gulls cried overhead. No waves lapped against the rocks. Aiden's boots crunched against the gravel-like sand. The sound almost too loud in the oppressive quiet. His equipment bag, laden with vials, scanners, and notebooks, felt heavier than usual. He attributed it to nerves and the foreboding nature of the place. The cave lay northward, a yawning mouth carved into the cliffs. He approached cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the dense fog rolling from its depths. The entrance was rimmed with a strange, crystalline growth, pale green and faintly translucent. He knelt to examine it, his gloved fingers grazing the surface. It was cold to the touch, but not in a natural way. It felt like the absence of warmth, as though it drew energy from the world around him. He recorded a sample, his excitement momentarily eclipsing his unease. Further inside, the cavern walls were lined with more of the growths, some pulsating faintly, as though alive. The air grew damp and thick with the mineral tang of salt, mixed with something sweeter, almost cloying. His flashlight flickered, but he shook it off, adjusting the batteries and pressing deeper. The bioluminescence started faintly, soft glimmers of blue and green that danced along the cave walls like fireflies. He crouched to inspect a particularly vibrant cluster, his scanner whirring softly. The readings were strange, no matching data in his archives. It was organic, yet not entirely. He leaned closer, adjusting the focus on his camera. That's when he noticed it, a faint imprint in the sediment beneath the grove. Not footprints, but drag marks, deep and uneven, as though something large and heavy had been pulled through. They led deeper into the cavern, where the bioluminescence grew brighter, almost beckoning. A rational voice in his mind urged caution, but the promise of discovery was too great. He followed the marks, the cave narrowing until he had to crouch to proceed. The walls seemed to ripple in the dim light, the crystalline growth spreading like veins. The drag marks ended abruptly at a pool of inky water that mirrored the cave ceiling perfectly, creating the illusion of infinite depth. Aiden's breath caught. The pool was unlike anything he'd seen. The bioluminescence concentrated here, swirling beneath the surface in mesmerizing patterns. He set his bag down, preparing to collect a sample. As his hand hovered above the water, it moved. Not a ripple caused by his presence, but a deliberate, languid shift, as though something beneath was stirring. His pulse quickened. He aimed his flashlight into the pool. For a moment, he thought he saw shapes, long, sinuous forms coiling and uncoiling just beyond the light's reach. But they vanished as quickly as they appeared. And then, the whispers began. At first, he thought it was the wind tunneling through the cave. But there was no wind. The sound was subtle, like voices heard underwater. He froze, straining to make sense of the murmurs. They weren't random. They were calling his name, Aidan. The sound was soft, almost tender, yet it chilled him to his core. He scrambled backward, nearly knocking over his equipment. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Aidan, join us. The pool erupted. A towering mass of black ichor surged upward, its surface writhing with countless translucent tendrils that glowed with the same eerie light as the crystalline growth's eyes, too many to count, opened across its shifting form, each one locking onto him with a hunger that defied comprehension. Aidan turned to run, but the cavern walls seemed to close in. The crystalline veins pulsed violently, casting disorienting shadows. The tendrils lashed out, one grazing his arm. Pain seared through him, not physical but emotional. A torrent of grief, despair, and longing flooding his mind. It was overwhelming, like reliving every regret and loss he'd ever known. He stumbled, clutching his head. The creature loomed closer, its form constantly shifting, voices emanating from its core. They weren't whispers anymore. They were screams, a cacophony of voices pleading, weeping, and laughing hysterically. The pool wasn't a source of life. It was a prison, and the thing before him was both warden and inmate. In a desperate bid, Aidan grabbed a vial of the crystalline growth from his bag and hurled it at the creature. The vial shattered against its form, and for a brief moment, the light dimmed, the tendrils recoiling as though in pain. He didn't wait to see the aftermath. He ran, the cave seeming to twist and pulse around him, the whispers chasing him like a rising tide. He burst into the open air, the mist swallowing him whole. The silence of the island was deafening, the weight of the encounter pressing on his chest. He stumbled to his boat, not daring to look back, as the engine roared to life and the island receded into the distance. He saw it. The mist wasn't natural. It clung to the island like a living thing, tendrils of it reaching out toward the sea. And within it, faint but unmistakable, countless eyes watched him go. Aidan left the Usani archipelago, abandoning his equipment and research. He never spoke of what happened on Krevrith, but the nightmares never ceased. He'd wake drenched in sweat, the sound of whispers still echoing in his ears, and somewhere in the vast ocean, the mist of Krevrith lingered, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to answer its call. Story 2. The scent of overripe mangoes hung heavy in the humid afternoon air, thick and cloying, not the sweet, inviting kind, but the kind that hinted at decay, at something hidden just beneath the glistening skin. Alara adjusted the strap of her leather satchel, the worn edges cool against her palm. She wasn't here for mangoes, though the vendors lining the narrow alleyway of the bustling Marrakech souk were doing their best to entice her. She was searching for something far less tangible, something whispered about in hushed tones by old men sipping mint tea in shadowed corners. Alara, an archivist with a penchant for the arcane, had come to Marrakech following a fragmented inscription found within the brittle pages of a forgotten Ottoman text. It spoke of a collector of echoes, a being that resided within the labyrinthine heart of the Medina, and possessed an unnatural affinity for the lingering resonance of past moments. Not memories, she stressed to herself, never memories, but faint, almost imperceptible vibrations that remained after an event, like the phantom hum of a struck tuning fork. She finally found the door tucked away behind an overflowing spice stall, almost swallowed by shadows. No sign marked it, just a simple, intricately carved wooden panel depicting a stylized ear-like motif. A shiver, not entirely unpleasant, prickled her skin. This was it. Taking a deep breath, Alara pushed the door open. It swung inward silently, revealing not the dusty workshop she expected, but a surprisingly spacious chamber. The air here was different, lighter, almost brittle. The scent of mangoes was gone, replaced by a faint metallic tang, like ozone after a storm. The walls were bare, painted a muted, almost absorbing gray. There were no windows, yet the room was bathed in a soft, diffused light that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. In the center of the room stood a single figure, not human, not entirely. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, tall and slender, but its limbs were elongated, almost insectile. Its skin was smooth and iridescent, shifting subtly in color like oil on water. Where a face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless plain. It didn't turn as Alara entered, yet she felt an undeniable sense of being observed, scrutinized. "You are the collector of echoes," Alara stated, her voice echoing strangely in the silent chamber. The figure tilted its head, a movement that was unsettlingly fluid. Then a sound began to emanate from it. Not a voice, not in the traditional sense. It was a complex tapestry of sounds, overlapping and interwoven, yet somehow distinct. Alara recognized the faint clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the lilting call of a muezzin, the sharp intake of breath that precedes a sob. These were not just sounds. They carried the weight of the moments in which they occurred. "I am called Jareth." The sounds resolved themselves into a semblance of language, though the words were formed not by vocal cords, but by the precise manipulation of captured sound. "You seek the echoes," Alara nodded, her throat suddenly dry. Alara nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "The inscription spoke of your ability to retain them." Jareth glided closer, its movements effortless, almost ethereal. As it moved, the echoes around it seemed to intensify, swirling like dust motes caught in a sunbeam. She heard fragments of conversations, bursts of laughter, the mournful wail of a lost child. It was overwhelming, disorienting. The past is not gone. Jareth resonated, the sounds rippling through the air. It merely fades. I prevent the fading. I collect the vibrations that linger, the imprints of what once was. Alara swallowed, trying to process the implications. "Can you show them?" Jareth was silent for a moment, or perhaps 1,000 moments, compressed into a single pause. Then, the air around Alara shimmered. The gray walls dissolved, replaced by the vivid, chaotic scene of the marketplace outside. But not as it was now. This was a marketplace from decades ago. The clothing different, the faces younger, the air thick with the scent of different spices. She saw a young girl chasing a stray chicken. She saw 2 men haggling fiercely over the price of leather, their voices sharp and animated. It was as if she were standing within a living photograph, a moment snatched from the relentless flow of time. But it wasn't just visual. She felt the heat of the sun on her skin, the rough texture of the cobblestones beneath her feet. She smelled the acrid smoke from a distant brazier, heard the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer. It was a complete sensory immersion, a perfect replica of a moment that had long since vanished. The vision shifted, sliding seamlessly into another echo. This time, it was a dimly lit courtyard, bathed in the soft glow of a crescent moon. A lone figure sat on a stone bench, their head in their hands, their silent grief palpable. Alara could almost feel the weight of their sorrow, the crushing despair that emanated from them. The echoes continued to flow, each one distinct, each one containing a fragment of a forgotten life. Joy, sorrow, anger, love, all the myriad emotions of human existence, preserved within these fleeting sonic vibrations. It was breathtaking, terrifying, and utterly mesmerizing. But as the visions continued, Alara began to notice something unsettling. Some of the echoes felt wrong. There was a subtle dissonance, a discordant note within the harmony of the past. She saw a group of people gathered well, their faces contorted in expressions of fear and anguish. But the sounds associated with the scene were muted, distorted, as if something was actively suppressing their cries. She saw a man running through the streets, his face a mask of terror, but his footsteps were silent, his panicked breaths inaudible. "What are these?" Ilara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jareth's resonant tones filled the space. These are the silenced echoes. Moments where the resonance was disrupted, where the natural flow was interfered with. Ilara felt a chill crawl down her spine. Interfered with, another echo shimmered into existence, a grand chamber filled with richly adorned people. Laughter and music filled the air, but beneath the surface, a layer of something else, something cold and predatory, pulsed like a hidden heartbeat. She saw a figure lurking in the shadows, its face obscured, but its presence radiating a palpable sense of malice. The air grew heavy, suffocating. "Some echoes are not simply remnants," Jareth explained. "They carry intent, influence, the echoes of actions that leave a stain on the fabric of time." The figure in the shadows moved, its hand reaching out, and as it did, the sounds of laughter and merriment abruptly ceased, replaced by a chilling silence, a silence that felt heavy, oppressive, pregnant with unspoken horror. Ilara recoiled, stumbling backward. "These are malevolent echoes." Jareth did not answer directly. The image dissolved, replaced by another, even more disturbing, a dark subterranean chamber. Figures chained to the walls, their bodies emaciated, their eyes vacant. The air was thick with the stench of decay and despair. But the most horrifying aspect was the silence, not the natural silence of an empty space, but a forced silence, a silence that screamed of unimaginable suffering. "These are the echoes I struggle to contain," Jareth resonated, the sound carrying a hint of something akin to weariness, the echoes of acts so heinous, so resonant, that they threatened to unravel the very fabric of continuity. Ilara understood now. Jareth was not merely a collector. It was a guardian, a warden of the echoes, chained to lingering vibrations of the past, both beautiful and terrible, preventing them from polluting the present, from warping reality itself. The weight of that responsibility, the sheer magnitude of the horror it contained, pressed down on Ilara. She looked at Jareth, at its featureless face, and saw not a strange alien being, but something akin to a silent sentinel, bearing an unbearable burden. The vision ceased, and the gray walls of the chamber solidified around them once more. The metallic tang in the air seemed stronger now, tinged with the faint, acrid scent of fear. "Why show me this?" Ilara asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Because the echoes are growing stronger," Jareth resonated. "The balance is shifting. The silenced echoes are awakening." A cold dread washed over Ilara. The overripe scent of mangoes, which she thought she had escaped, seemed to seep back into the chamber, now carrying a sinister undercurrent. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that the whispers of the old men in the souk held a truth far darker and more profound than she could have ever imagined. The past was not just a memory, it was a force, and sometimes the most terrible moments refused to stay silent. Story 3. I loved the character they held. Creaky floors, drafty windows, and the sort of charm that comes only with age. So when I found the old Victorian house for rent, I didn't think twice. It had been empty for years, the walls worn and faded. But it was affordable, and it felt like the perfect place for a fresh start. The first few days were uneventful. The house had that musty, stale air that only old buildings have, but a few candles and some air fresheners helped. I spent my time unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting to know the house quirks. It was quiet. Eerily so. And I began to find comfort in the solitude. But then, on the fourth night, something changed. It started with a noise, a soft scraping sound coming from above me. I stood still for a moment, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The attic. The house had an attic, though I had never bothered to check it out. I'd been in the basement, explored the rest of the house, but the attic door was locked, and I hadn't thought much about it. I tried to brush it off as a mouse or something, but the noise persisted. It was faint, almost like footsteps, dragging along the floorboards above my head. I stood up from the couch, my pulse quickening. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a broom, just in case, though I couldn't explain why I felt so uneasy. I took the broom in hand and made my way to the stairs that led to the attic. The old wooden steps creaked beneath my weight as I climbed. The door to the attic was just as I had left it, old, weathered, with a rusty lock on it. Old, weathered, with a rusty lock on it. But the scraping noises continued, louder now, more deliberate. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. What was making that sound? Why hadn't I heard it before? I unlocked the door with trembling hands and pushed it open. I unlocked the door with trembling hands and pushed it open. The attic was dark, the air stale and thick with dust. I couldn't see much, but I could feel the space stretching out above me, vast and empty. I stepped inside, the wooden floorboards groaning under my weight. I glanced around but saw nothing unusual. There were boxes, old furniture covered in sheets, but nothing seemed out of place. The sound had stopped, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. I felt stupid for being so paranoid, but as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small old trunk, tucked away in the far corner of the attic, its lid half open. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I didn't remember seeing it when I first came up. My curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to it, my hand trembling as I reached for the lid. Inside, there was nothing but a bundle of old tattered clothes, some sort of brownish fabric. I leaned in closer, and then, beneath the clothes, I saw it. A small, leather-bound book. I picked it up, brushing off the dust, and opened it. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the handwriting was still legible. I began to read. The book was a journal of sorts. It seemed to belong to someone who had lived in the house many years ago, though the entries were vague, as if written in a hurry. At first, it was just mundane details about the weather, about life in the house, but then the entries grew darker. I hear the scraping at night. I tried to ignore it, but it won't stop. It's coming from above, from the attic. I think it's trying to get out. I froze. I turned the page. It's been following me. The thing in the attic. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. It's getting closer. I shuddered, my hands shaking as I read the words. The journal went on like that for pages, recounting strange noises, disturbing encounters, and the gradual descent into madness. But then the entries stopped abruptly, just as the last one read. It's here. I slammed the book shut, my heart racing. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something was watching me. I spun around, but the attic was still empty. I had to get out. I bolted out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had just read. Who had written that journal? And what did they mean by, "It's here"? I tried to dismiss it as a relic of the past, a story left behind by someone who had let their imagination run wild. But then I heard it again, the scraping sound. This time it was closer, and it was unmistakably a footstep. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the stairs. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The steps grew louder, closer, until I could hear them right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty hallway stretching out before me. The air grew thick, oppressive, and the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in front of me, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of someone standing. I slowly turned around again, my heart pounding in my chest. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was a figure. A man. His face was pale, gaunt, and covered in dark, matted hair. He was dressed in old, ragged clothing, like something out of another time. His eyes were wide, empty, as if he hadn't seen the light of day in years. And he was smiling, a twisted, unnatural smile that made my stomach turn. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to get away from him, but my legs felt like lead. He started to move toward me, slow and deliberate, each step creaking beneath him. I turned and ran, not knowing where I was going, just needing to escape. I flew down the stairs and into the living room, but he was still there, following me. I could hear his footsteps echoing behind me, getting closer with every step. I reached the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. I finally got it open and bolted outside into the night, gasping for air. The cold night air hit me like a shock to my system, and I ran, not stopping until I was a few blocks away. I didn't look back. I didn't go back inside the house. I don't know what I saw that night, whether it was real or some trick of the mind, but I do know one thing. I can never go back to that house. The journal, the footsteps, the figure in the hallway, they haunt me. I still hear the scraping sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, and I know, deep down, that whatever was in that attic is still there, waiting. Story 4. The vintage fixtures. The small quirks that came with age. It all seemed like part of the charm. I've been living in the building for a few months now, and while it had its downsides, like the noisy plumbing and the thin walls, it had its appeal. The location was great, and the rent was affordable for the area. But it wasn't until a few weeks after I moved in that I began to notice something strange about my neighbors. At first I didn't think much of it. I had a neighbor on the floor above me, and another one next door, but I rarely saw either of them. The building was quiet, but that was normal, right? People are busy, and most of the time, the only sounds I heard were the faint hum of the refrigerator or the occasional thud of footsteps in the hallway. But then, I realized I hadn't heard a single sound coming from their apartments. No voices, no television, no footsteps. Nothing. I'm not a nosy person, but curiosity got the better of me. I knocked on the door of the apartment next door, just to introduce myself. No answer. I knocked again, and after a long pause, I heard faint rustling from inside. I figured maybe they were busy or didn't want to be bothered, so I left it at that, but the silence gnawed at me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Weeks went by, and the odd stillness of the building became unsettling. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I would occasionally hear muffled sounds, like something heavy being dragged across the floor, or a chair scraping against the tiles, but it always stopped so abruptly that it felt unnatural, like it was being forced to end. I found myself growing anxious every time I heard those sounds. I even tried to talk to the neighbor above me, knocking on their door one evening. Again, no answer, though I could swear I saw a shadow move behind the frosted glass of the door. That's when I started to notice other oddities. I saw lights on in their apartments at night, but when I tried to speak to them during the day, no one was ever home. I became obsessed with it. I would sit by my window at night, watching the windows of the apartments across the hall, hoping to see some sign of life. But there was nothing. It was as if the other residents simply didn't exist during the day. One night, I decided to get to the bottom of it. I had enough. I waited until late in the evening, when everything in the building was eerily quiet. I grabbed my keys and made my way to the neighboring apartment, the one next door that I'd knocked on before. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the exit signs. I stood in front of the door, hesitating. The rustling sound I had heard earlier drifted through the thin walls, making my pulse race. I took a deep breath and knocked. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time. Silence. I was about to turn away when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps from inside the apartment, coming closer to the door. My heart skipped a beat. The door creaked open, just a crack, and a face appeared in the narrow gap. It was a woman, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that didn't seem to blink. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity, her lips pressed tightly together. "Can I help you?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. I swallowed hard. I just wanted to introduce myself. I live across the hall, I stammered. She didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at me, her eyes unblinking. It was like she was studying me, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "I haven't seen you around much," I continued, trying to break the silence. "Is everything okay?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she slowly shook her head, a subtle movement, as if she was trying to decide whether or not to speak. After a long moment, she said, We don't like to be disturbed." Her voice was flat, emotionless. She closed the door without another word, and I was left standing there in the hallway, my mind racing. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. The encounter left me rattled. I went back to my apartment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The silence in the building had become suffocating, and the woman's words echoed in my mind. "We don't like to be disturbed." Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I decided to do a little digging. I went down to the building's laundry room where I knew I could find some of the tenants. As I was folding my clothes, I overheard two older women talking in hushed tones. They were discussing the neighbors in the apartment next to mine. "Did you hear about the people in 3B? One of the women whispered. "No one's seen them in years. They don't leave the apartment, and nobody's ever allowed in." The other woman shushed her. "Don't talk like that. You know what they say about that place." They both fell silent, exchanging wary glances. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. What were they talking about? I asked the women casually, trying to sound nonchalant. "What do you mean by no one's seen them in years?" The first woman hesitated, then whispered, "The people who live there. I've been living there for a long time, but nobody really knows anything about them. It's like they never age, always the same. It's said they don't even need to leave their apartments. I don't know. It's just strange." I left the laundry room quickly, my head spinning. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I thought about going back to my apartment, but my curiosity got the better of me. I had to know more. I went back up to the third floor and stood in front of the apartment door. I pressed my ear to the door, listening intently. At first there was nothing, just silence. Then I heard it. Faint murmurs, like voices talking in hushed tones. But there was no movement, no sounds of footsteps, no creaking floorboards. It was like the voices were coming from nowhere. I couldn't take it anymore. I tried the doorknob. It turned, but the door didn't open. It was locked, but it felt like something was pressing against it from the inside. I pulled my hand away and stepped back. That's when I noticed something, a small red stain near the base of the doorframe, barely visible unless you were looking for it. It was fresh, like someone had spilled something. Blood. I stumbled back. I stumbled back. I stumbled back, my stomach churning. I had to get out. I don't know what happened to the tenants in 3B after that night. I moved out the next week, not bothering to look back. But sometimes, when I walk past the building on Oak Street, I can help but glance up at the windows, and sometimes I swear I see a face staring down at me. A pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes. Watching. Waiting. Story 5. I'd never believed in the supernatural. Never thought much about things like ghosts or curses. That was until I moved into the old apartment on Oak Street. It wasn't much. Small, with peeling paint on the walls and a musty smell that no amount of cleaning seemed to fix. But it was cheap. I had just gotten out of a relationship, and the idea of a new place, a fresh start, seemed like exactly what I needed. I spent the first few days unpacking, setting up my things, trying to make the place feel like home. But there was something about the apartment that made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't until the first night that I realized something was wrong. I had just finished eating dinner and was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels when I noticed it. The mirror in the hallway. It was an old, ornate thing, its edges carved with intricate designs, but the glass was cloudy, streaked with grime that no amount of cleaning could remove. At first, I thought it was just the lighting, but as I stared at the reflection, I saw something move behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding. The hallway was empty. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe the shadows playing on the wall. But the next night, it happened again. I was sitting on the couch, this time with a book, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The mirror, there it was again, a figure moving behind me. I jumped to my feet, this time much faster than before, and rushed into the hallway. But no one was there. My pulse was racing. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm down. Maybe I was just imagining things. I'd been stressed lately. New place, new job, all that. But then, I saw it. I saw it. In the reflection of the mirror, a figure was standing just behind me. A woman, tall and thin, her face obscured by dark hair that hung in front of her eyes. She wasn't there in the hallway, but she was in the mirror, staring right at me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was like the air had thickened, pressing down on me, suffocating me. My own reflection seemed to warp, like it wasn't quite mine, as if someone else was standing there instead of me. The woman in the mirror took a step forward. I gasped, my legs trembling, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. She moved slowly, deliberately, and with each step, I felt my skin crawl. It was as if she was coming closer, as if the glass was no longer a barrier between us. Her face was still obscured by her hair, but I could feel her eyes on me, cold and empty. I backed away from the mirror, my breath shallow and rapid. I ran into the living room, trying to tell myself it was just a hallucination, just a trick of the mind. But the fear lingered, gnawing at me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind racing, replaying the image of the woman in the mirror over and over again. At one point, I even heard a soft whisper, like someone was calling my name. I bolted upright in bed, but there was nothing, just the silence of the apartment. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. Stress, anxiety, lack of sleep. I went to work, trying to put the whole thing behind me. But as soon as I walked back into the apartment, I felt it again. The unease, the creeping sense that something wasn't right. The mirror. It was like it was calling to me, beckoning me to look into it. I avoided the hallway, staying away from it as much as possible. But the next night, I found myself drawn to it again. I don't know why. I couldn't help it. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. It looked normal enough. Just me, tired from work. But as I looked closer, I noticed something. My reflection wasn't quite right. My movements were slightly off, as though it was a split second behind mine. I stepped closer to the mirror, watching myself. Then, the reflection smiled. I froze, my heart stopping. I hadn't smiled. I hadn't moved my mouth at all, but there it was, my reflection grinning at me, its eyes wide with something dark. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The reflection stayed where it was, still smiling, still watching. I couldn't tear my eyes away, and for a moment I felt as though I was falling into the mirror, pulled in by that smile. But then, it stopped. My reflection went still, and I was left staring at myself in silence. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to leave, to pack up and never look back, but I couldn't bring myself to. I felt trapped. The next few days, the strange occurrences only escalated. The whispering started again, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. I would hear it when I was alone in the apartment, sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes in the hallway. Sometimes it sounded like a voice, calling my name, other times like a soft murmur, like someone was speaking just out of reach. And always, there was the mirror. Every time I passed it, I felt that same cold, suffocating presence, as though it was waiting for me. I couldn't escape it. I tried to cover it up, to hide it, but it didn't help. The whispers grew louder, and the reflection. Oh, the reflection. It was no longer just behind me in the mirror. It followed me. At night, I would catch glimpses of it from the corner of my eye, always there, always watching, always moving. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, and see it standing at the foot of my bed. A shadow, darker than the darkness around it, just watching. I knew then that it wasn't just in the mirror. It was everywhere. It was in the walls, in the air, in the very fabric of the apartment. I tried to leave, but I couldn't. I would pack my things, get ready to go, but when I reached the door, I would turn back, compelled to go back to the mirror. The woman in the reflection was still there, waiting. The last night I spent in that apartment was the worst. The whispering was deafening, the air thick with the presence of something ancient and malevolent. I stood in front of the mirror one last time, staring at my reflection. It was smiling again, that same dark, twisted grin, but this time it was different. The reflection stepped out of the mirror. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear as I watched it approach me, its eyes glowing with a sickly light. It reached out a hand, and I could feel the coldness of it even from where I stood. "It's time," it whispered, its voice like 1,000 other voices, all speaking at once. I screamed, but no sound came out. I turned and ran, but the apartment stretched out endlessly, the hallways twisting and shifting, as though the walls were alive, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. The last thing I remembered before everything went black was the feeling of cold fingers wrapping around my wrist, pulling me back toward the mirror. I woke up in a hospital bed, my hands trembling. my mind fractured by the memory of what I had seen. The doctors told me I had a nervous breakdown, that I had been found unconscious in the apartment, but I knew the truth. The mirror had taken me. It wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway, and it was waiting for the next person to come through. And I knew, deep down, that it was still waiting, watching for me. Story 6. Merrow Hill was a place shrouded in mystery, its existence barely known to anyone outside the surrounding villages. The hill was covered in dense fog almost year-round, and its old church stood isolated on its crest, with only the faintest outlines of gravestones marking the site of the forgotten crypt beneath. Many in the nearby towns avoided the place, speaking of it in hushed tones and warning those who were brave or foolish enough to seek out its secrets. The crypt had not always been a place of dread. Long ago, the church had been a center of worship and community, its congregation one of the wealthiest in the region. The Merrow Hill family, who had owned the land for generations, were benevolent in their rule, ensuring that the village prospered. But their good fortune had begun to turn when young William Merrow Hill, heir to the family's fortune, had returned from a long journey abroad. It was said that when William came back to Merrow Hill, he was changed. There was something dark in his eyes, a kind of madness that no one could quite explain. He spoke of an ancient relic he had found during his travels, a relic that promised to grant eternal life. It was rumored that he had stumbled upon an old manuscript that outlined a ritual to summon the forces of the underworld, one that could grant immortality at the cost of the soul. Over the next several years, strange occurrences plagued Merrow Hill. People began to disappear, their bodies never found. Livestock was found mutilated, their carcasses left in bizarre formations around the churchyard. William's behavior became more erratic, and whispers spread that he was no longer fully human, but something far darker. The villagers, terrified of the curse that seemed to hang over the land, avoided Merrow Hill and the crypt beneath it. The Merrow Hill family disappeared from public view, and the church slowly crumbled into ruin. Generations passed, and soon, Merrow Hill was all but forgotten. However, the crypt beneath the church remained, its existence barely remembered by those who still lived in the nearby towns. But for one curious group of explorers, Merrow Hill was an enigma that begged to be solved. They had heard the rumors, read the stories, and were determined to uncover the truth about the crypt. Among them was a historian named Thomas, fascinated by local legends, who had spent years researching Merrow Hill. He was joined by his friends, Claire, a photographer with an eye for capturing the supernatural, Mark, a geologist with a keen sense for uncovering buried secrets, and Sarah, an investigator with a passion for solving mysteries. Together they set out to visit the hill, intent on discovering what lay hidden beneath the earth. Their journey began with a hike up the foggy path leading to the church. The landscape seemed strangely silent, as if the land itself held its breath. The church loomed in the distance, its stone walls weathered by centuries of neglect. As they approached, they could see the remnants of gravestones scattered throughout the yard, most of them illegible, worn by time and exposure. "This place gives me the creeps," Claire muttered, adjusting her camera. "It's as if it's been forgotten for a reason." Mark nodded in agreement, his gaze fixed on the decaying structure ahead. "There's something about the earth here, the soil. It feels different." Thomas, though equally uneasy, was determined to find answers. "The crypt should be below the church," he said, pointing to the old, crumbling building. "I've read about it in old records. No one knows where it is exactly, but they say it holds secrets. Secrets that could explain what happened to the Merrow Hill family." As they stepped inside the church, a chill ran through the air, and the smell of damp wood and mildew filled their lungs. The floor was cracked, and the pews had long since been stripped away. Broken stained glass windows filtered in weak light, casting colorful but unsettling shadows across the room. The altar stood at the far end of the room, still untouched by time. Though its once glorious carvings had eroded, the air felt heavy, as though something was watching them from the shadows. Sarah pulled out her flashlight and swept the beam across the floor, her eyes searching for any clue that might lead them to the crypt. This place, it feels wrong. I don't know how to explain it. Claire raised her camera and took several photos, the lens clicking softly in the eerie silence. I'm getting some strange readings from the energy here, she said, lowering her camera. It's like the atmosphere is charged with something, almost alive. They moved through the building slowly, their footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. At the back of the church, hidden behind a fallen beam and some rubble, they found a trapdoor. Its surface was weathered, but it appeared intact. This has to be it, Thomas said, his voice trembling with excitement. He knelt down and cleared the debris, revealing a rusted iron handle. With a grunt, he pulled the handle, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the darkness below. Let's be careful, Mark said, his tone serious. We're not just exploring a forgotten place. We could be walking into something far more dangerous. They descended the stairs one by one, the air growing colder with each step. The walls of the narrow passage were covered in ancient symbols, some of which appeared to glow faintly in the dim light. As they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a large underground chamber. The floor was covered in dust and the remnants of old ritualistic symbols, scrawled in a language none of them recognized. At the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal, its surface covered in scratches and gouges, as if something had been dragged across it. This looks like is the place, Thomas whispered. This is where the rituals took place. Sarah shone her flashlight across the room, her beam catching something in the corner. A door. It was hidden behind a large broken statue, almost as if someone had tried to seal it off. But the door was slightly ajar, and the faintest light flickered from within. They approached cautiously, the silence pressing in on them like a physical weight. As they pushed the door open, a rush of cold air hit them, and the room beyond was revealed. Inside was a crypt, lined with ancient coffins and mummified remains. The walls were adorned with more symbols, and at the far end of the room was an altar, the dark stone slab stained with something that looked disturbingly like blood. It was there that they saw him, the figure of a man standing motionless by the altar. His eyes were empty, hollow sockets that seemed to draw them in, and his skin was stretched tight across his bones, as though he had not aged a day since his death. His clothes were tattered and his hand clutched something, an object of strange design. What is that? Claire whispered, pointing to the object. It was a small dark idol, its shape twisted and unnatural. It seemed to hum with an energy that sent chills through the group. Without thinking, Thomas stepped forward, reaching out to touch the idol. The moment his fingers brushed against it, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned, and the air became thick with a heavy, oppressive force. The shadows around them twisted and writhed, taking shape and form, as if the very darkness had come to life. From the corners of the room, whispering voices began to emerge, low, guttural sounds that grew louder with each passing second. You should not have disturbed us, one voice rasped. You have awakened the curse. The shadows seemed to move toward them, and the room began to spin. The idol in Thomas's hand pulsed with dark energy, and the air grew cold enough to freeze their breath. We need to leave now, Mark shouted, his voice panicked. They turned to flee, but the door they had entered through slammed shut, trapping them inside. The shadows closed in around them, the whispers growing louder, filling their minds with horrifying thoughts. You are ours now, the voices chanted. You are ours now, the voices chanted. Your souls will be the price for disturbing the crypt of Marrow Hill. As the darkness engulfed them, they realized that the curse of the Marrow Hill family was not just a legend. It was alive, and they had become part of it. Their bodies were never found, but the whispers of their fate were passed down through the generations, and the crypt of Marrow Hill remained a place to be feared. its secrets buried, its curse never forgotten. Story 7. Eldridge Hollow was a forgotten place. Nestled deep within a fog-covered valley, the village had once been bustling with life, but over time, it had faded into obscurity, leaving only a handful of old homes standing amidst the dense trees. The hollow was quiet, too quiet, and most of the people who once lived there had vanished or moved away, leaving behind only whispers of strange happenings and eerie tales. Among the tales that circled through the nearby towns, the most chilling one was the story of Eldridge House, the once beautiful estate that had become a symbol of terror. The mansion stood at the far edge of the village, surrounded by an overgrown garden and a rusted iron fence. It had been built generations ago by the Eldridge family, who were known for their wealth and influence, but their riches had come at a terrible price. The family patriarch, Sebastian Eldridge, was rumored to have made a pact with dark forces in exchange for power and eternal life. It was said that after the pact, the Eldridge family members never seemed to age. However, their immortality came with a horrific curse, one that slowly drove them to madness. The mansion had fallen into disrepair after the last of the Eldridge family died under mysterious circumstances. The house remained empty, and the villagers avoided it, believing that the curse of the Eldridge family still lingered within its walls. Most avoided even speaking of the house, fearful that it might draw the attention of whatever malevolent force had claimed the family. But for one man, the lure of the mystery was too great to resist. Ethan was a curious soul, an aspiring writer with a fascination for the supernatural. He had heard the rumors of Eldridge House from his grandfather, who had grown up in the area and knew the stories well. After years of hearing the eerie tales, Ethan decided it was time to see the house for himself, to uncover the truth behind the mystery. He packed his bags and made his way to Eldridge Hollow, determined to uncover the dark history that had plagued the village for so long. The journey was long, the roads winding through dense forests and narrow paths. When he finally arrived at the village, it was late in the afternoon. The fog that shrouded the hollow made it seem as though the entire place was suspended in time. There were no people in sight, only the sound of wind rustling through the trees and the occasional creak of an old wooden sign swinging in the breeze. Ethan made his way through the empty streets toward the outskirts of the village where Eldridge House stood. The mansion loomed in the distance, a towering structure with dark windows and a steeple that reached toward the sky. The closer he got, the more the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The house seemed to draw him in, its dark presence enveloping him in a heavy silence. When he reached the front gates, he found them ajar, as though inviting him inside. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping through the gates and into the overgrown yard. The house seemed to watch him, its crumbling facade a reminder of its former grandeur. The windows were shattered, the once beautiful garden now a tangle of weeds and vines. Ethan felt an unsettling chill as he approached the front door. He reached out and turned the handle, expecting resistance, but the door opened with a soft creak. Stepping inside, he was immediately hit with the smell of mold and decay. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was almost oppressive. The floors groaned under his weight as he ventured deeper into the house, the only sound his own footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The walls were lined with faded portraits of the Eldridge family, their eyes following him as he passed. Each room he entered seemed to be more decayed than the last, the furniture covered in a thick layer of dust, and the once grand chandeliers now dim and broken. It was clear that the house had not been lived in for many years, but as Ethan explored, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The air grew colder as he made his way up the grand staircase, the steps creaking beneath his feet. At the top of the stairs he found a long hallway, and at the end of it, a door that was slightly ajar. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he pushed the door open, he was greeted by a room unlike any other in the house. It was large and spacious, with high ceilings and a massive fireplace. But what caught his attention was the large, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. It was framed in gold, its surface clouded with age, but there was something strangely captivating about it. Ethan stepped closer, drawn to the reflection in the mirror, but as he gazed into it, he felt a sudden coldness wash over him. The reflection in the mirror wasn't his own. It was something else. The figure in the mirror was a man, but his features were distorted, his face twisted in agony. Ethan recoiled in horror, but the reflection remained. Its eyes locked onto his. A chill ran down his spine as he backed away from the mirror, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But before he could leave the room, he heard a voice, a soft whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. "You shouldn't have come." Ethan spun around, but there was no one there. The voice echoed through the room, growing louder. "You've awakened what should have stayed buried." Panic surged through him as he turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The temperature in the room dropped, and the shadows seemed to shift around him. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "The curse is not broken," they hissed. "It is waiting for you." Ethan tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. He pounded on it, his heart racing as the air grew colder and colder. The whispers were now a chorus, a cacophony of voices that filled his ears, drowning out everything else. And then the door opened, but it wasn't the door that Ethan had been trying to escape through. Instead, it was a doorway that had never been there before, leading down a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, drawn by an overwhelming sense of dread. The stairs creaked beneath his feet as he descended into the abyss. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with old stone, and in the center of the room stood an altar, covered in strange symbols. And there, standing in front of the altar, was the figure from the mirror. It was not a reflection. It was real. The man's face was twisted in a permanent grimace of pain, his eyes hollow and empty. He reached out with a gnarled hand, his fingers curling into a claw. "You've come to claim your place," the figure whispered, its voice a rasping hiss. "Join us in our eternal suffering." Ethan tried to back away, but the figure's hand shot out, grabbing him by the wrist. The air grew thick with a dark energy, and the room seemed to close in around him. He felt the life being drained from his body, the curse of the Eldridge family taking hold of him. As his vision blurred and his body grew weak, he heard the sound of a bell, a distant, echoing toll that seemed to reverberate through his very soul. And then, darkness. The villagers found Eldridge House just as it had always been, silent and abandoned. But when they looked inside, they saw that the mirrors were no longer empty. They saw the reflections of the Eldridge family, their faces twisted in agony, trapped forever in the curse that had claimed them. And in the shadows, a new figure appeared, his face just as twisted as the rest. The curse had claimed another soul, and the hollow would never be the same again. Story 8. Blackstone Keep was an ancient fortress, standing tall against the wind-swept cliffs of a forgotten coast. Its stone walls, weathered and worn, seemed to absorb the light of the sun, casting long, unnatural shadows over the desolate landscape. Locals had long avoided the keep, for the stories surrounding it were as old as the stones themselves. They said it was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had perished within its cold stone halls. The keep had once been home to the Blackstone family, a powerful lineage that had ruled the region for centuries. But after the sudden and mysterious disappearance of Lord Aldrich Blackstone, the last heir, the fortress had been abandoned. Over the years, whispers had spread about strange occurrences, disembodied voices in the night, flickering lights in the tower windows, and shadowy figures seen at the edge of the woods. No one dared to approach the keep, not even the bravest of adventurers. But to a group of thrill-seeking explorers, the tales of Blackstone Keep were nothing more than an invitation. They saw it as a challenge, an opportunity to uncover the truth behind the eerie legends. The group consisted of 4 friends. Mark, the leader, eager to prove his courage. Emily, the skeptic, who believed it was all superstition. Lucas, the history buff, fascinated by the castle's past. And Sarah, the photographer, excited to capture the ghostly sights for her social media followers. They arrived at the foot of Blackstone Keep on a moonless night, the air thick with mist. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of salt from the distant ocean. The keep loomed ahead, its silhouette barely visible in the darkness. The large wooden doors, covered in vines, creaked as they pushed them open, revealing the crumbling interior. The air inside was damp, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the halls. The floorboards groaned underfoot as they stepped inside, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. As they ventured deeper into the keep, they noticed the walls were lined with faded tapestries, some torn, and others hanging by mere threads. The flickering light of their flashlights cast long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Sarah was the first to feel it, the oppressive weight of the place. It was as if the walls themselves were watching them, waiting for something. She turned to her friends and suggested they head back, but Mark was determined to press on. "We came here for a reason," he said, his voice resolute. "We'll find out what's really going on in this place." They continued on, moving past grand halls and empty chambers. In one room they found a grand fireplace, its hearth cold and empty, but it wasn't the fireplace that caught their attention. It was the massive portrait that hung above it. It was of Lord Aldrich Blackstone, a tall, imposing figure with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to follow them wherever they went. The longer they stared at the portrait, the more unsettling it became. "This is what's left of the Blackstone family," Lucas said, his voice filled with awe. "Lord Aldrich's father built this keep, and he had a reputation for being ruthless." Emily shivered. "I don't care what his reputation was. Something about this place feels wrong." They continued through the keep, their footsteps echoing through the vast emptiness. As they made their way to the tower, the temperature seemed to drop, and the air grew thick with a strange, oppressive energy. The further they ascended, the more the shadows seemed to move, stretching and writhing in the corners of their vision. Lucas pulled out an old map he had found in one of the keep's dusty libraries. This tower was once the heart of the Blackstone family's power, he explained. They believed it was the focal point of their ancestral magic. Some say that Lord Aldrich's disappearance was connected to a forbidden ritual he was attempting. Sarah was snapping pictures of the tower when she paused, noticing something strange. In one of the photos, there appeared to be a figure standing in the doorway of a room they had just passed. She turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. "Did you guys see that?" she asked, her voice shaking. There was something in that doorway. Emily peered into the hallway but saw nothing. "It's just the shadows playing tricks on you," she said, though her own voice had a tremor to it. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She quickly checked the photo again, but the figure was no longer there. She felt a chill run down her spine. As they reached the top of the tower, the atmosphere shifted. The room was cold, its windows darkened by grime. In the center stood an altar, its surface cracked and covered in strange symbols. The walls were adorned with faded paintings and old relics, their faces twisted in grotesque expressions. The moment they entered, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang, locking them inside. Panic set in as they tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" Mark shouted, pulling at the door handle. "We're trapped." Suddenly, a low, guttural voice echoed from the corners of the room. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but then it grew louder, more distinct. "Leave, or be claimed." It warned. Sarah, trembling, turned to the others. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others nodded, their faces pale with fear.
"Who's there?"
Emily called out, her voice shaky.
"Show yourself."
But there was no answer, just the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing across the floor. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, moving like living things, creeping toward them. They tried to back away, but the room seemed to grow smaller with each passing second. The air became thick with an unbearable pressure, and their breaths became shallow, as though the very air was being squeezed from their lungs. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You should not come," the voice hissed. "The curse of Blackstone Keep claims all who enter." The shadows suddenly surged forward, engulfing them. They screamed, their voices lost in the blackness as the shadows swallowed them whole. When the first light of dawn broke over the cliffs, the villagers found the keep eerily silent. The winds had died down, and the mist had lifted, revealing the full grandeur of the crumbling fortress. But when they entered Blackstone Keep, they found nothing. No sign of the explorers, no trace of their presence. The doors were wide open, as if they had never been sealed at all. The portraits still hung in the halls, their eyes still watching, and in the tower, the altar remained untouched. But the whispers could still be heard on the wind, faint and distant, a warning to anyone who might venture too close. Blackstone Keep had claimed its victims once again, and as the shadows stretched long into the day, the curse of the Blackstone family endured. Tyrannizian as our hearts. Story 9. Shadowmoor Pass was a treacherous mountain trail that few dared to cross after sunset. The jagged cliffs and thick forest were foreboding enough, but it was the legend of the Lantern Keeper that truly kept travelers away. Stories told of a spectral figure wandering the pass, carrying a lantern that glowed with an unnatural pale light. Those who followed the lantern never returned. Ellis Grady was a courier who prided himself on taking risks. Others wouldn't, hired to deliver an urgent parcel to the town on the other side of Shadowmoor. He scoffed at the warnings of locals. "Superstitions don't scare me," he told the barkeep who tried to dissuade him. By the time Ellis set out, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the narrow trail. The air grew colder, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes in the fading light. Despite his confidence, an uneasy feeling crept over him as he climbed higher into the mountains. The forest fell silent, no rustle of leaves or chirping of birds to break the oppressive quiet. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A faint glow weaving through the trees. A lantern. Ellis froze, his breath catching in his throat. He'd heard the tales, but dismissed them as nonsense. Yet there it was, flickering like a ghostly flame, moving slowly ahead. His rational mind told him to turn back, but curiosity and the need to complete his delivery pushed him forward. He followed the light at a cautious distance, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. The lantern moved steadily, always just out of reach. Ellis called out, his voice trembling. "Who's there?" The light paused, hovering in the darkness. Then, it began to move again, faster this time, as if urging him to follow. Against his better judgment, he quickened his pace. The trail grew narrower and more treacherous, the drop-off to his left plunging into a black abyss. The lantern's glow illuminated the path just enough to guide him, but it felt wrong, like it was leading him somewhere he shouldn't go. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of sulfur filled his nostrils. A low hum began to vibrate through the air, growing louder with each step. Suddenly, the lantern stopped. Ellis hesitated, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The light flickered, revealing a figure holding the lantern. Its form was cloaked in shadow, its face obscured by a hood. The hum grew deafening, and Ellis realized it wasn't coming from the figure. It was the air itself, vibrating with an unnatural energy. "Why do you follow?" the figure rasped, its voice like wind through dead trees. Ellis stepped back, fear clawing at his chest. I thought you were guiding me." The figure tilted its head, and for a moment, Ellis thought he saw something glint beneath the hood. Eyes, impossibly dark and empty. "I do not guide, I claim." The lantern's light flared, blinding him. When his vision cleared, the figure was gone. But the light remained, now floating closer. It pulsed like a heartbeat, casting eerie shadows that danced across the jagged rocks. Ellis turned to run, but the path behind him had vanished, replaced by a sheer wall of rock. Panic set in as the light moved closer, its glow growing colder and more oppressive. He stumbled forward, the only direction left, the lantern always just ahead. The trail became unfamiliar, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. The hum grew louder, drowning out his thoughts. Finally, the path opened into a clearing, and Ellis stopped, gasping for breath. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient tree, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The lantern hovered beside it, illuminating a ring of stones at its base. Symbols etched into the stones glowed faintly, their meaning incomprehensible, yet deeply unsettling. "Leave the parcel," the voice commanded, though the figure was nowhere to be seen. Ellis hesitated, clutching the package tightly. It felt heavier now, almost burning in his hands. "What do you want with it?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The air grew colder still, and the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. "Leave it, or be claimed." Desperation overtook him, and he dropped the parcel onto the stones. The symbols flared brightly, the light from the lantern intensified until it consumed everything. Ellis fell to his knees, shielding his eyes. When the light faded, the lantern was gone, and the clearing was silent. The trail reappeared behind him, familiar and unbroken. He wasted no time fleeing back down the pass, the weight of the encounter pressing on his mind. Days later, the town on the other side of Shadowmoor reported a mysterious fire that consumed the mayor's estate. Witnesses claimed to have seen a pale lantern light moving through the flames. Ellis never returned to Shadowmoor Pass, but he couldn't escape its memory. Every night, as he lay in bed, he saw the flickering light in his dreams, always calling him back. Story 10. Raven Hollow was a small, almost forgotten village, tucked away in the hills, far from any major roads or towns. To an outsider, it would have appeared as nothing more than a cluster of dilapidated houses surrounded by dense forest. There were no welcoming signs, no friendly faces at the village's borders. It had been years since anyone from outside had ventured in, and the locals preferred it that way. The few who still called Raven Hollow home never spoke much of the past, as if the years had erased all memories of it. But there was one story that still lingered in the air, passed on by hushed voices around the hearth. The story of the bells. Years ago, before the village had fallen into ruin, Raven Hollow had been known for its towering church, with its grand spire that reached toward the sky. The bells in the church's tower rang out every hour, their deep resonant tones echoing through the hollow. It was a sound that brought comfort to the villagers, a reminder of time passing and lives continuing. But one night, the bells rang for the last time. It had been a particularly stormy evening, with rain falling in sheets and thunder cracking through the sky. The villagers gathered in the church for evening service, as they always did. But as the storm raged outside, something began to change. The bells, which had always chimed in harmony with the passage of time, suddenly began to toll out of rhythm. The sound grew louder, frantic, as if something or someone was forcing the bells to ring against their will. By the time the service had ended, the church was nearly empty, save for the few who stayed behind to investigate. And that was when it happened. The bell tower collapsed, a great crash that could be heard for miles. The church, once a proud structure, was reduced to rubble in an instant. Some said it was the storm that caused it. Others whispered of something more sinister, something unnatural that had been lurking within the walls of the church. But what no one could explain was the sound that followed. After the church had fallen, there was silence, broken only by the distant rumbles of the storm. But in that silence, the bells could still be heard, faintly ringing in the distance, their sound echoing through the trees. It was as though the church had not truly fallen, as though the bells still continued their toll, haunting the hollow. The villagers, shaken by the events of that night, quickly abandoned the village. One by one, they packed up and left, seeking refuge in nearby towns. But the legend of the bells remained. In the years that followed, Raven Hollow was left to the elements. The houses fell into disrepair, the roads grew overgrown with weeds, and the church, once a towering figure in the center of the village, became nothing more than a pile of stone and timber. Yet the bells, though no longer heard by human ears, seemed to echo in the hollow, faintly tolling, as if mourning the loss of what once was. Eve had heard the rumors of Raven Hollow long before she decided to visit. She had heard about the strange events, the abandoned houses, and the tale of the bells that never stopped ringing. It was the kind of story that piqued her curiosity, the kind of story that made her want to explore, to see for herself if there was any truth to the legends. When she arrived in the area, it was already late in the afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the landscape. The trees on the outskirts of the hollow looked dark and foreboding, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching out toward the horizon. Eve parked her car at the edge of the village and stepped out into the cool evening air. The silence that greeted her was overwhelming. There was no breeze, no sound of animals, nothing but an eerie stillness that hung heavy in the air. She felt an uneasy chill run down her spine, but she brushed it off as nothing more than the tension of being in an unfamiliar place. The first house she came to was completely abandoned. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. The building had once been a home, but now was little more than a hollow shell. Eve stepped closer, peering through the gaps in the wood, but saw nothing inside. It was the same with every house she passed. Each one had been deserted for years, left to decay in the elements. Yet, despite the clear signs of abandonment, the village still seemed alive. There was a palpable sense of presence in the air, as if the place itself was watching her, waiting. As Eve walked deeper into the hollow, she came to the ruins of the church. All that remained were broken walls, jagged pieces of stone, and a collapsed tower. The remnants of the bell tower were scattered across the ground, twisted metal and shattered rock mixed with the overgrown weeds. The silence around her was deafening. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the faintest echo of something distant, something old, seemed to hum in the background. Ev's heart raced, but her curiosity pushed her forward. She stepped carefully over the rubble, making her way toward what had once been the altar. It was then that she heard it. A faint ringing, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. The sound was unmistakable. The bells still tolling, though the church had been reduced to nothing more than ruins. The sound seemed to come from all around her, echoing through the trees, vibrating in the very air itself. Eve froze, her breath catching in her throat. The ringing was not coming from anywhere nearby. It seemed to be coming from far off, as though the bells were ringing in another time, another place, and yet the sound felt as though it was right beside her, pressing in from all sides. Her feet carried her unwillingly, drawn to the sound as if by some invisible force. She didn't know why, but she found herself walking deeper into the woods, following the echo of the bells. The further she went, the louder the sound became. It was no longer a faint tolling. It was deafening, a constant ringing that rattled her bones. Her head ached from the noise, but she could not stop. The path through the forest was barely visible now, obscured by thick undergrowth, but she pressed on, driven by the need to follow the sound. It led her to a clearing, where the trees seemed to part just enough to reveal a stone structure in the center. The shape of the building was vague, obscured by the growing mist, but the bells were clearer now, their tolling louder and more insistent. Ev's eyes widened as she realized where she had come. It was the church, the original church, the one that had stood before the village had been abandoned. It was there, in front of her, whole and undisturbed by time. The bells hung above her, swaying gently as they rang in the air. But there was something wrong. The bells were not ringing of their own accord. They were being pulled, as if something invisible was forcing them to toll. And from the center of the church, something moved, a shadow that rippled and twisted, a presence that beckoned her forward. Eve stepped into the clearing, her feet heavy with dread, but her body compelled her to continue. She reached for the church's door, her hand trembling as she placed it on the cold stone. As soon as her fingers touched the door, the bells stopped. And in the silence that followed, a voice, hollow and ancient, whispered into her ear, The bells never stop ringing for those who are lost." Story 11. The town of Blythe Hollow was no stranger to storms. For as long as anyone could remember, violent tempests had swept through the region with terrifying regularity. But there was one storm that stood out in the town's history, a storm so fierce that it left a mark on the land and the people that no one could ever forget. The storm arrived without warning, just as the sun began to set on a cool autumn evening. The sky turned an unnatural shade of green, the clouds swirling together in an almost deliberate pattern, as if something was guiding them. The wind picked up with a sudden brutal force, knocking over trees and sending debris flying through the air. The streets of Blythe Hollow emptied as the townspeople retreated into their homes, huddling together in fear. Among the town's residents was Ethan, a young man who had recently moved to Blythe Hollow in search of a quiet life away from the chaos of the city. He had always been drawn to isolated places, and when he found the small cottage on the edge of town, he knew it was the perfect place to start over. Ethan had heard the rumors about the town, about the storms that seemed to come out of nowhere, about the strange disappearances that had plagued Blythe Hollow for generations, but he had brushed them off as local folklore. He wasn't one to put stock in ghost stories and superstitions, but as the storm raged outside that night, Ethan began to feel a deep unease. The wind howled through the trees, rattling in the windows of his cottage, and the thunder rolled in waves, shaking the very foundations of the house. The air felt thick, charged with a strange energy, as though the storm itself was alive. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself that it was just another typical storm. But then he heard it. Faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind. A soft voice, barely audible over the roar of the storm, calling his name. "Ethan?" He froze, his heart skipping a beat. The voice sounded so real, so close, yet when he looked around, there was no one there. The room was empty. the only light coming from the flickering candles that barely held against the wind. Ethan stood up, his breath quickening. The voice came again, louder this time. Ethan. It was unmistakable now, and it sent a shiver down his spine. He rushed to the door, throwing it open and stepping out into the storm. The wind whipped around him, almost knocking him off his feet. But he could hear it now, the sound of footsteps crunching through the wet earth. They were coming from the woods, just beyond his cottage. Ethan's mind raced. Who could be out there in this weather? He hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed a lantern from the table, its flickering light barely illuminating the path before him, and stepped into the storm. The trees creaked and groaned in the wind as he made his way toward the woods. The voice, soft but insistent, continued to call his name, Ethan. It was as if the wind itself carried the sound, wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into the forest. He stumbled through the underbrush, the lantern's light casting strange, distorted shadows on the trees. The air grew colder, and the storm seemed to intensify with each step he took. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't stop. Something compelled him to keep going, to follow the voice, to find the source of the footsteps that echoed around him. He was close now, closer than ever before. The wind seemed to die down for a moment, and the only sound was his own breathing and the distant rumble of thunder. He reached a clearing in the woods, and there, standing at the edge of a darkened pond, was a figure. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, but as he got closer, the figure came into focus. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by a hooded cloak. The man stood completely still, his back to Ethan, staring out at the water. Ethan called out to him, but the man didn't respond. The voice that had been calling his name was gone now, replaced by an oppressive silence. The air felt heavy, thick with something he couldn't quite name. He took a step forward, and then another, but as he did, the figure turned, revealing its face. Ethan froze. The man's face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were hollow, empty voids where nothing could be seen. His mouth was a thin, twisted line, and his skin hung loosely from his bones, as though he had been dead for years. The man's gaze locked onto Ethan's, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. A low, guttural whisper filled the air. "You shouldn't have come." Ethan took a step back, his heart racing. His body screamed for him to run, to escape the suffocating presence of the man, but he couldn't move. The figure took a slow step toward him, its footsteps soundless against the wet ground. "You've awoken the Watcher," the figure said, its voice barely above a whisper. "And now you belong to the storm." The words sent a cold shiver down Ethan's spine, and he finally found the strength to turn and run. He sprinted through the woods, his heart pounding in his ears, but the storm had changed. The wind howled like a living thing, and the trees seemed to bend and twist, their branches reaching out as though trying to grab him. The earth beneath his feet shifted, as though the very ground was trying to swallow him whole. The figure was behind him, its footsteps growing louder with each passing second. "You can't escape." The voice echoed through the trees. "You are part of the storm now." Ethan pushed himself harder, the darkness closing in around him. He could hear the sound of the figure's footsteps behind him, growing faster, closer, but no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't outrun it. The storm was everywhere now. The wind was a living, breathing force, pushing him forward, forcing him to move. The trees loomed like giants, their limbs swaying in the tempest, their shadows shifting unnaturally. His lantern rolled away, its light flickering out as it came to a stop. He scrambled to his feet, but the storm was everywhere. The wind howled in his ears, The trees creaked and groaned, and the ground seemed to shift beneath him. He turned to face the figure, but it was gone. The forest was empty. The storm had subsided, the wind dying down, and the only sound was the distant rumble of thunder. Ethan stood alone in the clearing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The storm was over, but the air felt thick with an unnatural heaviness. As he turned to leave, he realized that the woods were no longer the same. The path that had led him into the forest was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of trees, and then, from the distance, he heard it once more. The voice, faint but unmistakable. Ethan. It was calling him again, this time from deeper in the forest. And Ethan knew, with a sinking feeling in his chest, that he would never escape. The storm had claimed him, and he would forever be its prisoner. The watcher in the storm was always waiting, and now Ethan was part of it. Story 12. The forest had always been a place of mystery for Charlie. He had grown up in a small town nestled at the edge of it. And as a child, he'd often been warned to stay away from the dense woods. There are things in there you don't want to see, his grandmother would say, her voice trembling as she spoke of the stories that had been passed down for generations. But Charlie, ever the skeptic, never believed in those tales. He dismissed them as mere folklore, nothing more than old superstitions meant to scare children. Now, as an adult, Charlie found himself drawn back to the forest. He had recently returned to his hometown after several years away, and the forest, its towering trees and thick underbrush, seemed to call to him. It was as if it had been waiting, patiently, for him to return. The first time he ventured into the woods after his return, it felt different. The air was thicker, more oppressive, and the familiar path he had walked as a child seemed unfamiliar, overgrown and wild. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled roots twisting out of the earth like veins, stretching toward him. The once bright and vibrant forest was now dark, the canopy so dense that little sunlight made it through, despite the unease gnawing at him. Charlie pressed on. The deeper he went into the forest, the quieter it became. There were no birds singing, no rustling of leaves in the breeze, just a suffocating silence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. He felt as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting. After what felt like hours of walking, Charlie stumbled upon an old stone foundation hidden beneath a tangle of ivy and moss. It was the remains of an old cabin, long abandoned. Its walls crumbled and weathered by time, but it wasn't the ruin itself that caught Charlie's attention. It was the feeling that something had been left behind, something forgotten. A low hum seemed to resonate from beneath the ground, faint but unmistakable, as if the earth itself was alive. Charlie crouched down, running his fingers over the moss-covered stones. The hum grew louder, and his heart began to race. There was something beneath the cabin, something buried. Without thinking, he dug at the earth, his hands tearing at the soil until his fingers touched something cold and smooth. A metal object buried deep beneath the foundation. With great effort, he pried it free. It was a small, rusted box, its surface covered in strange symbols he didn't recognize. A chill ran down his spine as he turned the box over in his hands. He had no idea why, but he felt compelled to open it. The box creaked as he pried it open, revealing an old yellow piece of paper inside. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but he could make out the words, the silent beneath. Do not disturb what has been buried. A sense of dread washed over him as he read the warning. But it was too late. He had already disturbed something, and he could feel it now. The weight of something watching him. The trees around him seemed to shift, their branches swaying in a wind that had no origin. The hum beneath the ground grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through his bones. Charlie stood up quickly, the box still clutched in his hands. He had to leave. The sense of wrongness in the air was palpable now, suffocating, as if the forest itself was closing in on him. He turned to leave, but the path he had come down seemed different. The trees had rearranged themselves, their trunks twisting in unnatural ways. The forest had shifted, as if it had become something else entirely. The whisper of wind in the branches became a low, guttural sound, like a voice, murmuring in a language Charlie couldn't understand. Panic rose in his chest. Panic rose in his chest. He started to run, but the deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if it were growing, expanding, trapping him. The air grew colder, and the hum beneath the earth seemed to shake the ground. He stumbled, his breath coming in short gasps as he tried to find his way back. But the woods were no longer familiar. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their bark twisted into shapes that seemed almost human, their branches reaching out as though trying to grab him. The whispers in the wind became louder, clearer, now sounding like voices calling his name. Charlie! It was his name, but distorted, drawn out, as if coming from the very earth beneath him. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but there was no one there, just the trees, silent, still, and watching. His heart pounded in his chest as he broke into a run again, but the woods seemed to stretch endlessly before him. No matter which direction he turned, he couldn't find the path. The darkness was thick, like a tangible force that surrounded him, pressing in from all sides. Charlie. The voice came again, louder this time, closer. He turned and saw a figure in the distance. A tall, thin figure, draped in tattered rags. Its face was obscured, but Charlie could feel its eyes upon him, burning into him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, as if it were being dragged through the air by some invisible force. He couldn't make out its features, but he knew it was not human. It was something else, something that had been hidden, buried beneath the forest. The hum beneath the earth reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the very ground beneath his feet. Charlie froze, his body paralyzed by a sudden wave of terror. The figure was almost upon him now, its shape distorting as it moved, flickering in and out of focus like a shadow caught in a storm. "You woke it," the voice said, its tone mocking, yet full of menace. "You disturbed what should never be disturbed." The ground beneath Charlie's feet began to tremble. The trees around him began to shake violently, their branches creaking and snapping. The forest was alive, its very roots moving, shifting beneath the earth. And then, from beneath the soil, something began to emerge. Dark, twisted shapes, writhing and reaching out like tendrils. The figure was almost upon him now, its hands outstretched, its body flickering with a broken light. "You will stay with us," it hissed. "Forever," Charlie screamed as the forest closed in on him. The ground gave way beneath his feet, and he plunged into darkness, the world around him collapsing as the hum rose to a deafening roar. His body was pulled into the earth, into the silent beneath, where the buried things waited, and as the last of his scream faded into the void, he understood the truth. The forest had never been just trees and soil. It was a prison, a place where things were hidden, things that had never been meant to see the light of day. And once they were disturbed, once they were awakened, there was no escaping them. The forest would claim you, and you would stay there, beneath the silence, forever. Story 13. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would ignore the signs. I used to scoff at people who claimed their homes were haunted, who insisted they saw shadows moving in the corner of their eyes or heard footsteps when no one was around. But that was before I moved into that apartment. It wasn't much. An old, one-bedroom unit on the 4th floor of a building on the edge of town. The kind of place you could only rent if you didn't ask too many questions. The landlord was nice enough, an older man who seemed more interested in telling me about the history of the building than anything else. But I didn't care. I needed a place, and this one was cheap. The first few days were uneventful. The place was small and cramped, but I didn't mind. It sounded small, like a faint tapping sound in the walls at night. At first, I assumed it was just the building settling, some old pipes rattling in the darkness. But after a few nights, it became harder to ignore. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and sometimes it would shift from tapping to scratching, like something was trying to get out. I told myself it was nothing. The building was old, after all. Maybe a rodent had gotten trapped in the walls, or maybe it was just the wind playing tricks. I tried to go about my life, but the noises continued. They followed me wherever I went in the apartment, like a whisper at the back of my mind. Constant, never-ending. And it wasn't just the tapping. Sometimes, when I woke up in the middle of the night, I could swear I heard breathing, shallow and raspy, coming from the other side of the room. I'd sit up, heart pounding in my chest. But when I turned on the light, the room was empty. Still, the first time I saw it was on a rainy evening. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but when I turned to look, my stomach dropped. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It was tall, its body a dark, shadowy mass that seemed to absorb the light around it. The figure had no face, just an empty void where its head should have been, and it seemed to pulse with a strange, unnatural energy. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. I just stared at it, my heart racing in my chest. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanishing into thin air. I sat there for what felt like hours, too scared to move, too scared to even leave the room. But eventually, I managed to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I had been too tired, too stressed from work. I told myself it wasn't real. But the figure came back. It wasn't every night, but it was often enough, always in the doorway, always silent, always watching. And as the days passed, it began to feel like it was getting closer. I could feel its presence in the room with me, like a weight on my chest, suffocating me, draining the life from the air. And then came the dreams. They started off simple enough. Dreams of being trapped in the apartment, unable to escape, unable to move. But the dreams soon turned darker, more twisted. In them, the figure wasn't just watching, it was touching me, reaching out with long, cold hands that seemed to stretch unnaturally. I could feel its fingers wrap around my wrists, pulling me closer, dragging me toward its empty face. And then there were the whispers. They started low, like the sound of wind rustling through the trees. But over time, they grew louder, more urgent. I could hear words now, but they weren't words I understood. They were something old, something dark, something that made my blood run cold. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was losing my mind. I tried to leave the apartment to get away, but every time I stepped outside, the whispers followed me. They were in the streets, in the alleys, in the air around me. It was like I was being suffocated by them, trapped in a web of dark energy I couldn't escape. I called the landlord, told him about the noises, the figure, the dreams. He listened patiently. When I mentioned the history of the building, his tone shifted. He told me not to worry about it, that it was just an old building with some quirks. He told me there was nothing to be afraid of, but there was something in his voice, something I couldn't quite place, something that made me doubt his reassurances. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers were louder than ever, and the figure was waiting for me in the doorway, its presence suffocating, its shape more defined than before. I knew then that it wasn't just a dream, that the figure was real, and was coming for me. I tried to run, to escape, But no matter where I went in the apartment, the figure followed. It was always there, always watching, always waiting. And that's when I realized something terrifying. There was nowhere to run. I was trapped in the apartment, trapped in the darkness, with no way out. And as the figure reached out for me, its cold, empty hand brushing against my skin, I knew I was never going to escape. That apartment had claimed me, and now I was part of it. Just another shadow, just another whisper in the walls. And every night, the figure would return, and it would always be watching through the... Yes, in story 14, in the small forgotten town of Cinder Hollow, there was a place no one dared to speak of. The old church at the edge of the woods. It had once been a place of worship, but over the years, it fell into decay, its doors long since sealed with rusted iron. The townfolk had a strange respect for it, avoiding the area like a wound that should not be touched. The church stood, dark and silent, a monument to something buried deep in the past. I had heard whispers about it since I was a child. Stories of a preacher who had vanished one night, along with the entire congregation, leaving behind only the faint scent of incense and a lone candle still burning in the back of the sanctuary. They said the church was cursed, but as I grew older, I dismissed it as superstition, until the day I found myself standing in front of its decrepit doors. I had just moved back to Cinder Hollow after years away, the weight of the past tugging at me in ways I couldn't ignore. Curiosity pulled me toward that forsaken place. As I approached the church, the air grew colder, heavier, like the earth itself was holding its breath. The windows, broken and stained with time, stared back at me like empty eyes. The doors were just as I remembered, ancient, scarred by years of neglect. But I didn't hesitate. I pushed them open with a creak that echoed far too loudly in the silence, the cold air rushing out to greet me like a forgotten memory. Inside, the church was untouched by time in a way that was almost unnatural. The pews, though dusty, still stood in neat rows, facing the altar where the preacher once delivered his sermons. The altar itself was draped in faded cloths, and an old, tarnished bell hung above it, swaying gently despite the stillness. But what caught my eye was the faint glow coming from the back of the room, a soft, ethereal light that seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own. My heart raced as I moved closer, each step feeling heavier than the last. It was there, behind the altar, that I saw it. A door, half hidden behind a tapestry, leading down into the earth. The glow was coming from below. Without thinking, I found myself descending the stone steps, the air growing thick with the scent of mildew and age. The light grew brighter the further I went, until I reached the bottom, where I found a small circular room. The walls were lined with shelves full of strange, dusty books and jars filled with something I couldn't quite identify. At the center of the room was a stone pedestal, and on it an object wrapped in cloth. I couldn't stop myself. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I unwrapped it, revealing a small, intricately carved box. The moment I touched it, the light in the room flared brightly, blinding me for a moment. When it faded, I found myself back in the sanctuary, the box still clutched in my hands. But everything had changed. The church was no longer silent. I could hear the faint whispers of voices, faint but growing louder, like they were coming from all around me. The temperature had dropped, and my breath came out in clouds, though I could still feel the weight of the box in my hands. And then I saw them, figures, shadowy and indistinct, moving slowly through the pews. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces hidden in shadow, but their eyes were fixed on me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the figures began to move closer. Panic surged in my chest as I turned and ran for the door. But it slammed shut in front of me with a force that sent me stumbling backward. I tried the door again, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows were closing in, and the whispers were now a cacophony of voices, all demanding something. Something I could not understand. Desperation clawed at me as I backed away, my mind racing for an escape. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, everything stopped. The whispers ceased, and the shadows melted back into the walls. The door creaked open, and I was free, gasping for air. I stumbled outside, clutching the box to my chest. The church behind me was silent once more, but I knew the truth now. Whatever had been buried here, whatever had been sealed away, was still watching, still waiting, and I had awakened it. From that day on, I could never escape the feeling that I was being followed. The whispers followed me, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing day. They came in my sleep, in the wind, in the sound of footsteps behind me when no one was there. I tried to return to the church, to return the box, but it was gone. I knew that it would go on. It vanished as though only the whispers remained, now louder than ever, and I knew that no matter where I went, they would never let me go. The curse of Cinder Hollow had been passed on to me. Story 15. The night air clung to my skin like a damp sheet as I walked down the narrow winding road leading to the old Whitaker estate. It had always been a source of local legends, whispers of haunting, strange lights flickering in the windows, and the occasional disappearance of curious souls. I felt drawn to it, though, a moth to a flame, despite the warnings etched into the town's collective memory. "Are you sure about this, Emily?" my friend Sarah asked as we approached the rusted gates, their hinges groaning in protest when I pushed them open. She had always been the sensible one, her nerves alive with caution. "Come on, it'll be fun, just a quick look around," I replied, grinning in the half-light. The crescent moon hung overhead, casting eerie shadows on the cracked path ahead. We stepped through the gate, our laughter echoing off the dilapidated walls of the estate. The mansion loomed before us, a monstrous silhouette against the night sky. I could almost hear it breathing, the wind whistling through the broken windows, carrying with it the faintest echo of something lost. As we crept closer, the front door swung open with a soft creak, inviting us in. I glanced at Sarah, whose eyes were wide, flickering between fear and curiosity. "It's just a house," I reassured her, though my voice trembled slightly. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and forgotten memories. The scent of mildew clung to the walls, and the floorboards creaked ominously beneath our feet. We wandered through the grand foyer, where the remnants of a chandelier dangled precariously from the ceiling. "Look at this place," I breathed, excitement bubbling in my chest. But as I stepped further inside, I felt a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. It was different from the cold night air. This was deeper, more penetrating. A sense of being watched settled over me like a heavy cloak. "Maybe we should go back," Sarah suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "This doesn't feel right." I hesitated, glancing toward the stairway that spiraled into darkness. "Just one more room. I want to see the library." The thought of dusty tomes and forgotten stories was enough to push my apprehension aside. We climbed the stairs, the wood groaning beneath our weight, leading us to a narrow hallway lined with doors. Each one seemed to pulse with secrets, but I was drawn to the end of the corridor, where a faint light flickered beneath a door. The light was almost inviting, a warm glow in the otherwise oppressive darkness. "Emily, wait," Sarah cautioned, but it felt too late to turn back. I reached for the knob, turning it slowly with a soft click. The door swung open, revealing a room that felt alive, as if the air itself vibrated with energy. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with books that looked untouched by time. In the center stood a large wooden table, covered in dust, but still sturdy. A single book lay open, its pages fluttering slightly, as if someone had just been reading it. "Is this real?" I murmured, stepping closer to the table. I could feel the warmth radiating from the book, and a shiver ran down my spine. Without thinking, I reached out to touch the pages, my fingers grazing the yellow paper. The instant I made contact, a loud thump echoed from behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but the hallway was empty, the shadows stretching as if they were alive. "Did you hear that?" I gasped, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her face pale. "We should leave now," but something held me there, a force I couldn't quite explain. I returned my gaze to the book, the words dancing before my eyes, pulling me in. I leaned closer, trying to decipher the scrawled handwriting, when another thump reverberated, this time louder, accompanied by a low moan that seemed to seep from the walls. "Okay, that's it?" Sarah exclaimed, grabbing my arm. "Let's go." I stumbled back, the book flipping closed as if it had a mind of its own. With a deep breath, I turned and rushed out of the room, Sarah close behind. But as we reached the stairway, the atmosphere changed. The air thickened, making it difficult to breathe, each step heavier than the last. "Emily, hurry," Sarah urged, panic lacing her voice. I glanced back, a chill racing up my spine. The hallway felt alive, shadows creeping along the walls, shifting and writhing like dark serpents. The door to the room slammed shut behind us with a resounding bang. Echoing through the silence, "Run!" I shouted, my heart pounding as we bolted down the stairs, the floorboards creaking beneath our frantic steps. We burst through the front door, the cool night air hitting us like a wave. But as we stepped outside, a strange sense of disorientation washed over me. The estate looked different, more sinister, as if the shadows had grown bolder. "Did we just go in a circle?" Sarah asked, her breath coming in quick gasps. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make sense of our surroundings. "No, it should be right here," I pointed. But the path that led us to the gate was gone, swallowed by the night. "What do you mean? We're trapped?" Fear seeped into Sarah's voice, and I could see her trembling. I turned back to the house, its windows like dark eyes watching us. "We need to find another way out," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. As we moved around the side of the estate, I could hear whispers carried by the wind, soft and beckoning. "Stay with me," I urged Sarah, gripping her hand tightly. The moonlight illuminated a broken window, and without thinking, I gestured toward it. "We can climb through there." Sarah hesitated, glancing back at the looming mansion. "What if something's watching us?" "There's nothing here but dust and shadows," I insisted, though my heart raced at the thought. We scrambled toward the window, the glass crunching underfoot as we climbed through. Inside, the air was heavy, and the feeling of being watched intensified. We found ourselves in a narrow hallway lined with more doors, each one closed and seemingly untouched. "Where do we go now?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's try one of the doors," I suggested, even as dread curled in my stomach. I stepped toward the nearest one and hesitated, my hand hovering above the doorknob. "Maybe we shouldn't," Sarah urged, but I could see determination in her eyes. "Just one more look," I whispered, and I turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with dust-covered furniture. A large mirror hung on one wall, its surface clouded but still reflecting our anxious faces. As I stepped inside, the temperature dropped, and my breath formed a mist before me. I could almost hear whispers, soft, enticing, filled with sorrow. "Do you hear that?" I asked, turning to Sarah. But she was frozen in place, eyes wide with terror. But she was frozen in place, eyes wide with terror. "What's behind you?" she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. I glanced back at the mirror, and my heart sank. In the reflection, shadows moved, twisting and writhing, coalescing into shapes that resembled faces, anguished and desperate. "Emily!" Sarah shrieked, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. I stumbled, the mirror's surface rippling like water, and for an instant I felt as if I was being drawn into it.
"Run!"
I screamed, and we dashed out of the room. Slamming the door behind us, we stumbled into the hallway, but it felt different now. The walls closing in. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices pleading and wailing, echoing in our minds. "Emily, we can't stay here," Sarah cried, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah cried, her eyes wide. I nodded, desperation clawing at my throat. "We need to find a way out." We raced down the hallway, doors slamming shut behind us, as if the house itself was trying to trap us. The shadows seemed to reach for us, fingers of darkness grasping at our ankles. I spotted a window at the end of the corridor, the faint glow of moonlight spilling through the glass. "There!" I shouted, leading the charge. As we reached the window, I could feel the cold air swirling around me, the whispers intensifying to a deafening roar. "Help us!" they cried. "Stay with us!" "No!" I shouted back, grasping the window latch. "We're getting out of here!" With a sharp tug, the window swung open, and I climbed through, pulling Sarah after me. We landed on the ground outside with a thud, the cool grass a welcome relief against our skin. Breathless, we scrambled to our feet, glancing back at the estate that loomed over us, dark and foreboding, but the whispers faded into the night. "What was that?" Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't know," I admitted, my heart racing. But we made it out. We stumbled back toward the road, the moonlight guiding our way. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching us, its secrets buried deep within. "Do you think anyone else has disappeared in there?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I shivered at the thought. "I don't want to think about it." But as we reached the edge of the property, I glanced back one last time. The window seemed to flicker, shadows dancing behind the glass, and for a brief moment, I felt a sense of loss, as if something had called to me from within those walls. "Let's go home," I said quietly, and together we stepped into the night, leaving the Whitaker estate behind us, but knowing that its darkness would linger in our minds forever. Story 16, it all started with a simple text from my friend Jenna. "Hey, you heard about that old Campbell house? Let's check it out tonight." I hadn't heard the stories she was referencing, but I knew Jenna well. She was the kind of person who thrived on adventure, and I was often pulled along for the ride, sometimes against my better judgment. "Sure, sounds fun," I typed back, my heart racing slightly at the thought of exploring a supposedly haunted house. I grabbed a flashlight, tucked it into my backpack, and headed out the door, the cool night air nipping at my skin. The Campbell house had been abandoned for years, a crumbling relic of the past with a reputation that kept most people at bay. A neighbor's kid had gone missing near it recently, and whispers of strange noises and flickering lights had begun to circulate. It was the perfect backdrop for a night of ghost hunting, or so I thought. When I arrived, Jenna was already waiting, her excitement palpable. "This place is legendary," she exclaimed, her eyes glimmering in the moonlight. "I heard it's haunted by the family that used to live here. They say they can still be heard crying for help." "Great," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. That's just what I want to hear. The house loomed before us, its silhouette a dark mass against the starry sky. The wood was warped, the windows shattered, and the door hung slightly ajar, as if inviting us in. Jenna pushed the door open with a creak that echoed in the stillness. "Let's go," she urged, stepping inside without hesitation. I followed, the air thick with the scent of decay and mildew. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight, and shadows seemed to flicker just out of sight. "Do you feel that?" Jenna whispered, glancing around the dimly lit foyer. I shrugged, trying to dismiss the chill that crawled up my spine. We moved deeper into the house, the floorboards groaning beneath our weight. "Look at this," Jenna said, kneeling to inspect a faded photograph that lay on the ground. It depicted a family of 4, their faces solemn, eyes staring at something beyond the frame. "Creepy, right?" "Yeah," I replied, glancing at the photo. "They look sad." Jenna flipped it over, revealing scrawled handwriting on the back. "We are lost. We cannot leave." Her voice trembled slightly, but she laughed it off. Classic haunted house stuff. The living room was filled with dusty furniture, and a broken chandelier hung precariously overhead. I could almost hear the echoes of laughter and family gatherings that must have filled the space long ago. But now it was just silence, punctuated by the distant sound of our footsteps. "Let's go upstairs," Jenna suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. My heart raced at the thought, but I nodded. Climbing the staircase felt like walking into a void. Each step brought us closer to the unknown. At the top, I paused, staring down a long hallway lined with closed doors. "What if someone is still living here?" I asked, a tremor creeping into my voice. Jenna scoffed, but I could see her unease mirrored in her widened eyes. "Come on. He'll be fine," she urged. "It's probably just the wind." We pushed open the first door on the left, revealing a bedroom frozen in time. The bed was unmade, the sheets yellowed with age, and toys lay scattered across the floor. The air felt heavier here, as if it held secrets that had long been forgotten. "Wow, this is unsettling," Jenna remarked. She picked up a ragged teddy bear, its button eyes staring back at us. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from downstairs, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. "What was that?" I gasped, my heart pounding in my chest. "Probably just the wind," Jenna said, though her voice lacked conviction. We exchanged a quick glance, the thrill of fear coursing through us. "Let's check it out," she suggested, her adventurous spirit pushing her forward. We crept down the stairs, the old wood creaking underfoot, and peered into the living room. Nothing seemed out of place, just the shadows playing tricks on our eyes. "Maybe it was just a loose shutter," I murmured, feeling foolish for my earlier fear. "Yeah? Or a ghost?" Jenna added with a nervous laugh. But as we turned to head back upstairs, I caught a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. Jenna turned, her face paling. "What?" Something moved, I insisted, pointing toward the darkened hallway. "I swear I saw it." With a hesitant nod, Jenna stepped forward. "Let's check it out." We moved toward the shadowed end of the hall, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. "Hello?" Jenna called out, her voice echoing in the silence. "Is anyone there?" The only answer was the soft rustle of something brushing against the wall, a faint whisper that seemed to beckon us closer. My skin prickled with fear, but I didn't want to show it. "This is stupid," I muttered under my breath. But Jenna was undeterred. She reached for the door at the end of the hall, her hand trembling as she turned the knob. It creaked open slowly, revealing a small, dark room. "Let's go in," she said, excitement evident in her voice despite the tension in the air. As we stepped inside, I felt a heaviness settle around us. Old furniture lay covered with sheets, and in the center of the room stood an antique mirror, its surface clouded with dust. Jenna moved closer, intrigued. "Check this out." I edged forward, peering into the glass. My reflection stared back. But then, something shifted. A shadow loomed behind me, dark and indistinct. I whipped around, but there was nothing there.
Did you see that?
I gasped, my heart racing again. Jenna turned, and for a moment, we were both still, listening. Then, a soft moan echoed through the room, a sound that chilled me to my core. "Help us," it seemed to say, reverberating off the walls. "Okay, it's definitely not just the wind," I stammered, backing away from the mirror. Jenna's face had gone pale, and I could see the fear mirrored in her eyes. "It's just a trick of the light," she whispered, though I could hear the tremor in her voice. "Let's get out of here." But before we could turn to leave, the door slammed shut behind us with a force that rattled the walls. I screamed. The sound echoed back at me, swallowed by the darkness.
"Let us out!"
I yelled, pounding on the door. Jenna joined me, her breath coming in short gasps.
"What do we do? Try the window!"
I shouted, rushing to the nearest one, but it was stuck tight. The room felt like it was closing in on us, and the moaning grew louder, almost like a chorus of lost souls rising around us. "Help us! Help us!" they cried, the voices intertwining into a haunting melody. "Stop it!" Jenna shouted, covering her ears as if that would drown out the sound. I felt a wave of panic wash over me, and I turned back to the mirror, drawn in by its dark allure. In its depths, I saw faces, pale and gaunt, eyes wide with terror. They reached out, their mouths moving in silent pleas. "Let them go," I screamed, my voice breaking. Suddenly, the mirror rippled, and I felt an icy hand grasp my wrist, pulling me closer. "No!" I yelled, fighting against its grip. Jenna was screaming now, and the panic surged through me. I had to get us out of here. With a burst of adrenaline, I lunged for the door, flinging myself against it with all my weight. It gave way with a splintering crack, and we stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" Jenna panted, her eyes wide with shock. "I don't know," I replied, shaking. "But we need to leave. Now." We raced down the staircase, the shadows flickering as if alive, and burst through the front door, tumbling onto the porch. The night air hit us like a wave, refreshing yet filled with the lingering chill of what we had just experienced. "Did we really just see that?" Jenna asked, breathless, her face pale. "I don't know," I said, still trying to process it all. "I don't know," I said, still trying to process it all, but I don't want to find out. We hurried away from the house, the whispers still echoing in my mind. The questions swirled. What had happened to the family? Why were they trapped there? My heart raced as I glanced back at the Campbell house, its silhouette dark against the moonlight, and I felt a strange pull, a haunting reminder of the voices begging for help. We walked in silence, the adrenaline from our escape slowly fading. "We should tell someone," Jenna finally said, breaking the stillness. "Maybe they can help," I nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at me. "What will you even say?" "Hey, we just went ghost hunting and found a haunted mirror." Jenna laughed, a shaky sound that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, it's not like anyone will believe us anyway." As we reached the end of the street, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The night was still, but the air felt charged, as if something was watching us. Jenna glanced back at the house one last time, her expression a mix of dread and curiosity. Maybe we should go back, she mused, almost to herself.
No,
I interrupted, grabbing her arm. We can't. We need to leave this behind. But even as I said it, I felt a tug in my gut, an inexplicable connection to that house and the lost souls within. The thrill of the unknown mingled with fear, and I knew this wasn't over. Days turned into weeks, and the experience lingered in my mind like a ghost, refusing to be exorcised. I tried to shake it off, but the stories of the Campbell house only grew. I heard about more missing persons, more strange occurrences, and whispers of a group planning to investigate. "Are you going back?" Jenna asked one night, her expression serious.
you know they say it's cursed now.
I hesitated, the pull of the house stronger than ever. I don't know. I feel like there's something there, something we need to understand.
You're not serious,
she replied, incredulous.
Maybe I am,
I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice.
We can't just leave those voices unanswered. Jenna stared at me, a mix of fear and admiration in her eyes. Be careful, okay? Okay.
If you go back, you have to promise you won't go alone.
Deal,
I said. Though I knew deep down I couldn't resist the call of the Campbell house. That night, I lay in bed, the darkness wrapping around me like a shroud. The whispers returned, soft yet persistent, calling out from the depths of my mind. "Help us, help us," they echoed like a haunting lullaby, lulling me into a restless sleep filled with shadows and lost faces. The next day, I found myself standing before the Campbell house once more, Jenna by my side. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice steadier than mine felt. "No," I admitted, my heart pounding as I reached for the doorknob. "But I have to do this." As we stepped inside, the air felt charged with anticipation, and the darkness enveloped us like a thick fog. The echoes of the past whispered around us, and I felt the weight of the lost souls pressing in. "Let's find that mirror," I said, my resolve strengthening. "I need to know what happened." We moved through the house, each creak of the floorboards amplifying the tension. The living room felt different this time, as if the house was aware of our presence. "Do you hear that?" Jenna whispered, her eyes scanning the shadows. I nodded, a low hum resonating throughout the space, growing louder as we approached the door at the end of the hall. "It's coming from there," I said, my gut twisting in anticipation. As we stepped inside the small rooms, the mirror stood before us, untouched and waiting. The surface shimmered, and I felt an overwhelming urge to reach out. "This is it," I breathed, stepping closer. "Wait!" Jenna grabbed my arm, her fear palpable. "What if it's dangerous? I have to try," I insisted, my fingers brushing against the glass. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift, the air thickening as the shadows writhed around us. The mirror pulsed with energy, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. "No," I gasped, turning to find Jenna frozen in place, her face pale with terror. And then I understood. The house hadn't been waiting for us to leave. The house hadn't been waiting for us to leave. It had been waiting for us to return. Story 17. The worn leather of my boots crunched on the fallen leaves, the sound strangely loud in the oppressive stillness. Sunlight, fractured by the dense canopy, barely reached the forest floor of the dame tree. Not that it mattered. It wasn't the sun I was worried about. I should be focusing on the undergrowth, the tangled vines and the possibility of snakes. But my mind kept drifting back to the map, a hand-drawn sketch really, with a series of X marks scrawled across it in a faded red ink. The notes it came with were worse, cryptic and unsettling. Something about whispers in the wind and the trees themselves watching. I'm not usually one for this kind of thing. I'm a geologist, not a ghost hunter. But the disappearance of my colleague, Ben, had pushed me into this. He'd been researching unusual mineral formations in this same area of the Daintree a few weeks back, and had sent that map just days before his comms went silent. The local authorities hadn't found anything, not even a trace of his equipment. So now it was up to me, I suppose. The air hung heavy, not with humidity, but with something else. Something thick and expectant. The usual forest sounds, the calls of birds, the rustling of small creatures, felt muted, as though they were holding their breath. The deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to press in, their gnarled limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers. It wasn't a welcoming feeling, more like being squeezed by something unseen. I pushed on, following the map, coming to a small clearing with a peculiar circular stone formation. The stones were smooth, almost polished, and arranged in a perfect ring. Not something you'd expect in a place like this. The whole area gave off a sense of being out of place, feeling like a wrong key in a lock. I ran a finger along the cool stone. It felt unusually smooth, unnervingly smooth for a rock that should have been coarse with moss and the elements. I took out my own GPS unit, but the signal was patchy and unreliable under the dense foliage, which was odd since we tested the same model everywhere else in the area. The silence felt heavier as well, and the feeling of being watched intensified, a prickle on my skin, like being a prey animal somewhere you're very, very exposed. I checked my watch. It had only been about an hour since I'd entered the forest, but time felt like it was stretching and distorting. I left the clearing, pressing further on. The map denoted another X about a kilometer through another patch of forest. The terrain began to change, the ground becoming softer, almost spongy underfoot. The trees were different too, taller, with thicker trunks that blocked out more light. The leaves were deeper green, almost black in the shadows. And then I noticed the scent. Not the usual earthy smells of the forest, but something else. Something cloying and sweet, like decaying flowers. Or maybe something else. I can't put my finger on it. I pulled out the map again, checking it against the trees around me. The faded ink seemed to vibrate and morph slightly. At first, it seemed to be my eyes playing tricks on me. I rubbed them hard and looked again. Maybe it was the effect of the strange light, but the red crosses on the map had gotten a shade darker. A deeper, almost blood red hue. I pushed the thought back down. Attributing it to stress, I came to a stream. The water opaque and still, reflecting the dark canopy above like a black mirror. There was no sound of running water, no bird song, no insects. Just the oppressive silence pressing down on me. I waded across it, the water surprisingly cold, shocking my skin. On the other side of the stream, the forest seemed to change again. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out in unnatural angles, and the air became colder, a sudden drop in temperature that made my teeth chatter. A shiver ran down my spine, and it had nothing to do with the stream. I looked at the map again. The fourth location. It was a sinkhole, not a proper one. Just a dip in the ground. I was there now. The ground was bare, the soil dry and cracked as if nothing could grow there. And around the edge, almost invisible beneath the leaves and loose earth, I saw markings in the dirt. Fine lines, like something had been dragged across the ground. There was no natural explanation. I circled the hole, my steps muffled by the loose soil. And then I saw it. A small silver object barely visible in the dirt on the edge. It was one of Ben's rock hammers. It was dull, and the grip was dirty, but it was his. My heart lurched. My hand went to his name written on the handle, engraved there when he first got it. I wanted to call out his name, to hear my voice break the silence, but I couldn't. It was like a thick, heavy blanket was wrapped around my throat, silencing me. The area felt heavier than before. The sense of being watched had intensified exponentially. I had seen the hand-carved stones, the strange map, the altered terrain, all of it pointing to something very wrong. I looked at my watch. An hour and a half had passed, yet it felt like the same single, long moment. The sky was beginning to darken, and I knew I should be heading back, but I didn't. Instead, I went down into the sinkhole, moving carefully. The air tasted different down there, like copper. The dirt was unnaturally loose. I moved the dirt away, digging with my hands, and as I did, I felt something solid. When I dug it up, it was not a rock, but a human skull. I pulled it from the dirt and held it, the smooth bone cold in my hands. It was hard to make out the details. The face had been stripped away by time or by something else. I dropped it to the floor with a thud. I reached out and moved more earth, finding another skull, and another, and another. The sinkhole was filled with them. I couldn't help myself. I began digging faster, like a man possessed by an unseen force. I clawed at the dirt, uncovering more and more skeletal remains. Then I stopped and felt sick. The forest had gone completely dark. I couldn't see beyond a few feet, and the air was different. Thick and cloying. Something was moving. I could feel it. It wasn't something physical, but something I could feel inside me. I backed away slowly from the sinkhole, my back against one of the trees. I looked around, trying to work out which way I had come, but the forest had changed. It was as if the trees had moved. I was lost. I stood there, frozen, every hair on my body standing up. The forest waited with me. That oppressive silence, heavier than ever. What started as a search for my friend had turned into something else, something I did not understand, something that did not want me here. There were no more sounds, not even the rustling of leaves, just me in this silence and the feeling of something moving all around me. And I knew, deep down, that the Daintree wasn't just a forest. It was something else, and I wasn't going to get out of it. I didn't know how long I stood there, but eventually I closed my eyes and accepted it. I felt it then. That final embrace, and then there was nothing, just the darkness and the silence. Story 18. The weight of my pack was a familiar ache on my shoulders. I've been trekking for 3 days now, pushing further into the emerald labyrinth that was the Mataranka jungle. The guidebooks called it a biodiversity hotspot, but to me, it just felt like a place where the sun forgot to shine and the shadows had teeth. I wasn't a thrill seeker, not really. I'm a botanist, and my work was my quiet obsession. I was here to collect samples of a certain rare orchid, rumored to flourish in the deepest parts of the reserve. The air hung thick and still, a damp blanket that clung to my skin. Sweat beaded on my forehead, tracing paths down my temples, and every breath felt like inhaling warm, wet cotton. It wasn't the oppressive, humid heat I'd expected. It was more like something else. Something heavy. Today, the trail was barely there. An impression of worn earth and broken twigs. I'd veered off the marked route yesterday, chasing a fleeting glimpse of a bird with iridescent plumage. That was a mistake, I knew it. But the allure of the unknown was potent. The trees here were ancient, their bark gnarled and twisted like the limbs of some grotesque giants. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy, casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. Strange, rust-colored fungi sprouted from the rotting logs, and the air carried a faint, earthy mustiness. like the smell of a forgotten tune. I'd heard rustling in the undergrowth for hours, not the familiar scampering of animals, but something heavier, something that always seemed to be just out of sight. I came to the edge of a clearing, a small circular space where the trees had pulled back as if in fear. A low, hummed sound vibrated in the air, a kind of resonating drone that set my teeth on edge. In the center of the clearing was a stone structure, a crude circle of weathered stones piled on top of one another. It wasn't natural. It felt deliberate. A strange unease settled in my stomach. I'd seen old ruins in my travels, the remnants of forgotten civilizations. But this was different. This felt malevolent. It was as if the place itself was breathing, exhaling that low hum that seemed to sink into my bones. I circled the structure, my boots crunching on the dried leaves. The stones felt cold, unnaturally so, even in the muggy heat. There were no markings, no carvings to suggest age or purpose. As I continued to circle the structure, I noticed something else. The normal forest sounds had ceased. The usual cicadas and bird calls had gone silent, replaced only by the drone of the stone circle. The silence pressed down on me, a weight that made my ears ring. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I pulled out my small notebook and began sketching the structure, trying to focus on details rather than the creeping dread that was working its way into my mind. I noted the uneven texture of the stones, the way they seemed to be stained a darker color at their base, as if absorbing something. The light began to fade, and the shadows grew longer, twisting the trees into monstrous shapes. I knew I should set up camp, but I found it hard to pull myself away from the circle. I took out my flashlight. Its beam sliced through the gathering gloom, revealing more of the clearing. With each sweep of the light, I thought I saw movement in the periphery, just at the edge of the beam, fleeting shapes that danced in the shadows. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just fatigue and my own overactive imagination. But the strange hum grew louder, the vibrations resonating within me. I finally set up my tent, a flimsy barrier between me and the darkness. I ate a quick meal of dried fruit and nuts, eschewing a loud, intrusive sound in the oppressive silence. I tried to read, but the words swam before me. My heart pounded against my ribs in a steady rhythm of fear. I switched off my flashlight and lay in the darkness. Not sleeping, just listening. I knew sleep was impossible. I could still feel that vibrating hum, a sound that spoke of something ancient, something beyond my comprehension. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself I was safe. But all I saw were shifting shadows in the corners of my tent. The next morning, I woke with a jolt. The sun, though still obscured by the canopy, felt different. It felt cold and thin, and somehow lifeless. The jungle itself seemed muted, as though it was holding its breath in anticipation. I carefully unzipped the tent. The stone circle still stood there, its dark presence palpable. But something had changed. A thin mist clung to the ground, a strange gray fog that swirled around the base of the circle. And the hum had become deeper, more forceful. A low thrum that vibrated in my chest and made my vision blur. The trees seemed closer, as though they had taken a step forward overnight. I took my samples, the leaves and petals I had come to collect. Suddenly, the urge to leave, to break free of this place, was overwhelming. I packed away my things faster than I ever had before, my hands trembling as I turned to leave, ready to rush blindly into the trees. It was there. I saw a shape at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the mist. It was a dark, indistinct form, taller than any man, and it seemed to sway like a tall grass in a breeze that wasn't there. I turned and ran. I pushed through the undergrowth, not caring about scratches or bruises. I didn't turn back. Every sound, every crack and rustle made my heart leap. I ran as I had never run before, trying to escape that place, that feeling. I haven't been back. I haven't been back. It's been a year, and I still have nightmares. Dreams filled with that low, vibrating hum, and that dark shape that sways in the mist. I know I should report it, try to explain what I saw. But how do you explain a feeling of utter, primal fear? How do you articulate the sensation of being watched, stalked by something that doesn't exist? I don't know, and maybe it's better that way. Maybe some things are best left lost in the depths of the jungle. I'd come to this part of Borneo on a hunch. A whisper of a rumor about the disappearances, not just the well-documented ones. The ecotourists who got lost, or the loggers who vanished without a trace. But the little whispers, the ones whispered low in village huts and ignored by officials, the stories of those who went into the emerald maze and something else came back. The air hung thick and heavy, not humid, not exactly, but weighted down somehow. The smell was earthy, a mix of decaying leaves and something acrid, like burnt sugar, that clawed at the back of my throat. I unpacked the gear slowly. Sturdy boots, a pack filled with essentials, and my compass, a relic handed down through my family, each mark worn smooth as glass. It felt right here, somehow. This old tool in the ancient jungle. The digital tech felt out of place, like a tiny, buzzing insect amidst a symphony of hidden things. The first few hours were uneventful, just the constant drone of cicadas and the soft padding of my boots on the leaf-strewn path. The light filtered down in dappled patterns, creating an illusion of constant movement, shadows stretching and shrinking like they had their own kind of life. I passed clusters of bizarre fungi, some bioluminescent with a faint, sickly green glow, casting an unearthly light on the forest floor. I decided to make camp at the base of a giant tuolong tree. It was an ancient beast, its immense roots like a gnarled network of veins. The air here was different, colder than I'd expected. As darkness crept in, the sounds of the jungle changed. The usual daytime buzz gave way to rustlings and clicks, things that scurry in the underbrush, accompanied by a low, guttural hum that seemed to resonate from deep within the earth. I lit a small fire, the dancing flames carving out a temporary circle of light against an abyss of darkness. The first unsettling thing was the way the firelight seemed to bend itself, as if something was breathing just beyond its reach. Shadows elongated and twisted, mimicking shapes I couldn't quite decipher. A branch would crack somewhere far off, and my head would snap around. But there'd be nothing there. I tried to rationalize it, blame it on the tricks of the darkness, but the hair on my arm stood on end. The next day I pushed deeper, leaving the faint track behind. The forest felt closer now, as if it were pressing in on me. The trees grew taller, their canopies interlocking to create an almost impenetrable dome above. Sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor, and the air felt thick and cloying like a damp shroud. I came across the remains of a camp, not a recent one, judging by the decaying canvas of a tent and the rusting cooking pot. There were bones scattered around, cleaned bare by the jungle's scavengers. Animal bones, I told myself, but there was something human-like in the way they were arranged, a strange, purposeful pattern that made my stomach churn. I didn't linger, my pace quickening, a cold knot of fear forming in my chest. The trees grew closer, the undergrowth forming a suffocating wall all around me. The humming sound from the night before was back too, this time closer, more resonant. It seemed to vibrate through the bones in my chest, a low thrum that set my teeth on edge. Something was out there, and I had the sickening feeling that it was aware of my presence. I started to see things in my peripheral vision, a flash of movement, the shadow of something tall, slithering between the trees. Every time I turned my head, There was nothing there. The jungle was playing tricks on me, but in a way that felt deliberate, as if it was teasing me, luring me further into its embrace. I tried to focus on the compass, the needle spinning wildly, as if lost itself. Then, I found the clearing. It was unlike anything else I'd witnessed in the jungle. A perfect circle, with no undergrowth, just bare earth. At its center stood a single massive stone, covered in strange carvings that seemed to writhe as I looked at them. The humming noise was at its peak here, almost deafening. The air was thick with the smell of burnt sugar, intensified tenfold. I felt a pressure in my head, a terrible bone-deep ache, like something was trying to burrow inside me. The images flashed before my eyes, like broken shards of glass. Faces contorted in terror, limbs twisting in grotesque angles, the terrible hollow stares of eyes that no longer belonged to the living. I fumbled for my camera, desperate to capture what I saw, or what I thought I saw, but my hands would not obey. They were trembling, useless, as waves of nausea crashed over me. I collapsed to my knees. The jungle went silent. The humming stopped. The images faded. Only the blood pounding in my ears. It was a false reprieve. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the forest itself was watching, waiting. I stumbled back, away from the clearing, each step agonizing. The trees seemed to lean in towards me, as if trying to grab at me, to pull me further into their embrace. The shadows stretched and shifted, no longer just shadows, but something else, something with substance to them. I don't know if it was hours or days, but I kept moving, driven by a primal instinct to escape. I didn't feel like myself anymore. I was just a collection of frayed nerves, a racing heart, and trembling limbs. The world had become something alien, a place of endless shadows and impossible sounds, where the lines between reality and nightmare were blurred beyond recognition. I found the dirt track just before dawn, the first rays of sunlight bleeding through the canopy. It was enough to feel almost human, almost sane. But the silence of the jungle followed me out, a cold and knowing weight that pressed down on my soul. I left the emerald maze behind, not looking back, knowing that whatever lurked within would remain there, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to wander too deep. And I knew, with utter dread, that a piece of it had come out with me. The taste of burnt sugar was still on the back of my tongue, and the memory of those shapes in the shadows still danced at the edges of my vision. Story 20. The thick, green canopy of the Amazon felt like a living thing, pressing down from all sides. It wasn't the oppressive heat I noticed first, but the silence, a strange, heavy silence that seemed to swallow all other noise. I'd spent the past week trekking solo through this part of Brazil, a research assistant on a grant, tracking bird migration patterns. This wasn't my first foray into the jungle, but this time, something felt different. The initial days had been almost idyllic. Sunlight dappled through the leaves, parrots screamed their vibrant calls, and the air hummed with the constant buzz of insects. I followed my GPS and meticulously took notes, feeling a sense of peaceful solitude. I even managed to get some fantastic photos of the elusive Hudson. But as I moved deeper, further from the river, the atmosphere started to shift. The vibrant sounds faded, replaced by an unnerving quiet that made the rustling of leaves sound like whispered secrets. It started subtly. At first, it was just a feeling of being watched. I'd stop to transcribe notes, and a shiver would run down my spine, as though eyes were boring into the back of my neck. I'd spin around, scanning the dense undergrowth with my binoculars, but there was never anything there, just the interlocking branches and long hanging vines. I brushed it off, blaming my overactive imagination, the isolation, and the fact I hadn't slept properly in days. The feeling intensified as I ventured beyond the established trails. I found myself in an area where the trees grew unusually tall and close together, their branches forming a dark, almost impenetrable roof. The sunlight barely touched the forest floor, creating an eternal twilight. It wasn't just the lack of light that bothered me. It was the shapes the shadows took. They shifted and elongated in the periphery of my vision, seeming to coalesce into grotesque forms before dissolving back into darkness. I began double-checking the path I was taking, certain I hadn't walked those ways before, that the turns weren't where my map said they should be. One day, I stumbled across a clearing. It was small, perfectly circular, and the ground was unnaturally bare and compacted. In the center, embedded flush into the earth, was a stone. Not just any stone, but a large, flat slab of black material that didn't resemble any of the natural rock formations I'd seen. It was completely smooth with no markings or imperfections. The air around it was cold, a noticeable drop against the heavy, humid environment. I touched it with the tip of my boot, a strange tingling sensation running through my leg. I took some pictures, a little unnerved by the stark contrast of the black stone against the surrounding green. That night, sleeping in my hammock, the sounds came. Not the familiar jungle noises, but whispers, faint, almost inaudible whispers that seemed to swirl around me. I strained to hear, trying to make out words, but they remained just elusive murmurs, like the wind passing through reeds. I told myself it was just the leaves brushing against each other, my mind playing tricks on me. Still, the unease kept me tossing and turning, the whispering continuing until dawn. I started to notice things out of place, things that shouldn't have been there. A single, perfectly round black feather lying on a bed of bright green moss. A small, intricately woven basket hanging from the branch of a tree, far too high for anyone to have placed there naturally. It was like someone, or something, was leaving little marks of their presence. The feeling of being watched was no longer a flicker. It was a constant, suffocating pressure. The GPS became unreliable, directing me in circles, until it finally just stopped working. My compass spun wildly, completely disoriented. I consulted my paper maps, but the paths and clearings no longer matched my surroundings. The trees seemed to shift around me, changing their shapes and forms. It wasn't just confusing. It was like the landscape was actively trying to disorient me, to confuse me, to keep me lost. I retraced my steps back towards what I thought was a familiar area, only to find that the small stream I'd used as a landmark had vanished. The jungle had folded into itself, rearranged its geography. Panic began to claw at the edges of my calm. I tried to keep my wits about me, to focus on the basic survival rules I had learned. I ate what little food remained and drank sparingly from my water supply. But survival became secondary to just trying to understand what was happening. One morning, I woke to find small marks scored into the bark of the trees around my campsite. Not random scratches, but almost glyph-like, in repeating patterns. The marks were new. They hadn't been there the night before. As I approached them, the familiar coldness returned to me, the same I had felt by the black stone. Looking closer, I realized that the marks were not carved in the bark. They were burnt into it. The wood dry and slightly charred, the whispers became constant. They wove themselves into the rustling of leaves, the drone of insects, making it hard to distinguish between what was real and what was in my head. It was more like a low hum now, surrounding me, a constant pressure on my psyche. I had the terrifying feeling that I was no longer alone, and that what was with me was waiting. I tried to force myself to think logically. I was in the jungle. I had probably just gotten lost, and I was letting my fear get the best of me. I tried the radio, but the static was deafening. I tried to make a fire, but the wood smoked and refused to catch. It was then that I broke, realizing that there was something more here. Something unexplainable. Something hostile. I packed up what little gear I had left and scrambled away, back into the deeper heart of the trees, unsure of where I was going, only knowing that I needed to move. I didn't know what was in the jungle, but I felt it all around me. It was in the shadows, the whispers, the cold spaces, and the feeling that things were not quite right. I don't think I'll ever truly understand what happened to me these past few weeks. I only know that I made it out, barely, and I cannot escape the sensation that something went back with me, something that I have brought out of the jungle and into my life. The whispers are quieter now, but they haven't gone away, and sometimes I see shadows that move when they shouldn't.